Watch this vidcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
So are you ready to start, Mr. Michael?
Yep.
Welcome to the 50th episode of Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show Podcast.
I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle, and I'm excited.
And I'm James Rivera. So this is a big episode for us. It's a big deal for us. We have our 50 podcast, which is something that we're very proud of. Since it's our 50th one, we feel like this is a milestone. We wanted to celebrate by kicking off our podcast with a bowl, so we're going to be getting high throughout this podcast. Our 50th episode is going to kick off our list of our top 50 horror films.
Yeah, no, these are our favorite horror films, and we're not saying that they're the best.
But some are.
Films. Yeah.
Some of them are.
Yeah. I actually put some superior films at the bottom of the list, but because others were my favorites, they made it to the top.
I need to preface that too. There's some of these films that if I were just to judge as films, not as horror films, certain ones may rise higher than others.
Yeah.
For example, Eraserhead is on my list. I'm not going to say where, but it has a very high spot. It's not in my top 10, but if I were just to count them basically as films, it probably would be in my top 10 or top 5, but we're counting horror films.
Yeah,
and this is personal preference as well.
Yeah, and one of my favorite films of all time is Santa Sangre. And it's technically a horror film, but it just wasn't enough of a pure horror film for me to make it in my top 50. So it's kind of weird to me that one of my favorite films of all time didn't make it into my top 50 horror films.
But it makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll get back to horror news next week because we have in a couple weeks because we have a big topic ahead.
Horror show exclusive.
Before I say I have one honorable mention, my honorable mention is Session 9 from 2001. It came very close to cracking my top 50, very close, because I found it to be a genuinely scary experience, and I was kind of blown away by how scared I was when I saw it. However, it's just one viewing very recently, and with time and more viewings, it might end up in my top 50, but as of right now, I couldn't do it. So my official 50 starts off with a choice that I know people are going to argue about. I know this is an unpopular opinion, but my number 50 is Curse of Chucky. I put it in there to represent the Child's Play franchise, and this one barely cracked my list. As a complete series of 7 films, Chucky, Child's Play, whatever you want to call it, is probably my favorite horror franchise, in the sense that I like pretty much every single one for vastly different reasons, and I love the way that the series keeps itself fresh when a lot of other slasher franchises just became repetitive and dull after a long time.
Yeah.
Individually, none of them are good enough to make my top 10, 25, but I had to put this one to represent the series. And the reason I put this one on is because it's the one that scares me the most. It's not the one that I'm the most nostalgic of. It's not the one that I've seen as many times. It's the one that shocked me the most. It's written and directed by Don Mancini, the creator of Chucky. And for my money, it's the best filmmaking of his career. He also directed Seed of Chucky and Cult of Chucky. After so many sequels where Chucky was reduced to kind of a punchline, and even then I still like those movies, this movie restores Chucky to his dignity, restores him to being a genuinely terrifying force of evil. And what I like about the movie the most is the way that it uses the audience's knowledge of Chucky to build anticipation the entire time. All the Chucky films preceding this, Chucky was blabbering on, always quipping, always going off. It wasn't since the first movie that he was kept hidden and in the background for most of the time. This one put Chucky back into the background, tense, spare, and mysterious, where you know as an audience member who Chucky is, but the characters aren't really not aware of what this doll is, so it creates a perfect sense of suspense. I love the camera angles. I love the use of the mansion that they have in the movie. I think it's a fantastic location, and it almost makes it work as a haunted house movie. Even though it's not really a haunted house movie, it manages to incorporate elements of the use of shadow, of darkness, the craft, the scares. Chucky is funny in this at times, but never to the detriment of how scary he actually is. Where in the previous sequels, he was mostly just quipping and making a lot of jokes. He becomes something like Freddy Krueger, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
This one, he has a few one-liners here and there that are pretty funny in that land, but for the most part, he remains a menacing supernatural doll. And for that reason, I am putting Chucky, Curse of Chucky, at number 50 on my list.
Cool. It's funny that you would say that because my honorable mention that did not make it into my top 50, it got kicked out right before we started the podcast. Child's Play, the original one from 1988.
Classic film.
Yeah, and so because this got thrown out, so none of the Child's Play movies are in my top 50. This one was directed and co-written by Tom Holland, who did Fright Night, who directed Fright Night. And it was co-written by Don Mancini, who co-wrote this one. He wrote 2, 3, Bride, Curse, and Cult. And then he directed Seed, Curse, and Cult. That's one of the reasons why it's stayed consistent, was it's had the same writer through every one of them.
And I feel like it's a series that's been driven by passion. Yes, it is driven a little bit by money, like all film franchises are. But the people involved and the creative minds are doing it because they love to do it and because they have fun making these movies. Their primary concern isn't financial gain. And Don Mancini seems to have carved a career out of the Child's Play franchise. Yeah. And it's given him an avenue to become a filmmaker where he used to be a screenwriter. And because Chucky can be so many different things, each of his Chucky outings has been vastly different from the one previous. His first one was Seed of Chucky, the first one he directed. Goofy and bizarre as all hell, followed by Curse of Chucky, which is my number 50, which is deathly serious, and then Cult of Chucky, which is a mixture between serious and goofy.
And I loved Tom Holland's directing along with Don Mancini's writing. Chris Sarandon was a big standout in it from Fright Night. I'm sure Tom Holland brought him along. Catherine Hicks was great as the mom, and of course the great Brad Dourif as Charles Lee Ray and Chucky.
Irreplaceable.
Yeah, just an irreplaceable, excellent voice. And I love the marketing plan at the time because they didn't show that it was a killer doll movie. They just showed Child's Play. They showed people getting killed, but they didn't show it was a doll. They showed that it might be Andy doing the killing. And so you go into the movie thinking that, and then when you find out, you're kind of shocked at the time when we went to see it in the theater that it was a doll.
And the original poster advertises it as a gothic horror film that looks like it's about a child killer.
Yeah. So that's one of the many things I love about the movie, but unfortunately it didn't make it into my top 50.
What did make it?
But what did, I can't believe it's down this low. Scream, directed by Wes Craven, written by Kevin Williamson. The biggest standout in it, of course, is Neve Campbell. She came along in 1996 and gave us one of the best final girl scream queens in history.
I agree. The Craft came out that year as well.
Oh yeah, she was a formidable opponent. Had a great ensemble cast with Courtney Cox, David Arquette, Rose McGowan, Jamie Kennedy, Matthew Lillard, Skeet Ulrich. A lot of their best movies, and that awesome opening scene, just the opening scene alone with Drew Barrymore was enough to make it into my top 50, but it just continued to be great from there and go into different directions. I like the comedic aspects of it. I thought the horror was pretty serious. The rest of it had such a spirit to it that the horror seemed almost out of place, like it almost seemed too graphic for that type of humor. I think that was the magic of Kevin Williamson's writing mixed with Wes Craven's directing and this great ensemble cast.
It really turned the slasher subgenre on its head upside down, because up to that point it pretty much had died off. People weren't looking for slashers anymore. The last Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street films were bombing. Yeah. So it gave it a fresh shot in the arm. This version of the slasher was much more self-aware, played upon its tropes in an ironic way, whereas in the original slasher films they didn't seem to be aware of the tropes. This one plays it up to great effect. Yeah. And what makes it a great horror film, in my opinion, is the fact that it's a genuinely funny, at times laugh out loud funny movie that sends up the horror genre, that sends up the slasher subgenre specifically, and makes it look ridiculous, while at the same time delivering a hardcore slasher movie that delivers breathtaking suspense, tension, and great kills at the same time. And none of these elements seem to cancel each other out.
I love how it starts so serious and really scary and gory, and then it ends like goofy and almost slapstick when you find out who the killers are, and you're like, that's who the killers were. It would almost kill the movie if it wasn't so
well done.
well crafted. Yeah. So I just love the radical change in tone from the beginning to the end. Just a perfect storm of all the right elements that we needed at the time. So that's why Scream is number 50.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
So my number 49 film is It Follows from 2014. I consider this one of the key movies to have kicked off the horror renaissance, as we like to call it, from the 2010s. I like it because I would describe it as a deceptively simple film that deconstructs the tropes of the slasher subgenre while delivering nerve-shredding thrills and suspense. And what it has in common with the movie you just discussed is Scream is that this is also a deconstruction of the slasher subgenre. But unlike Scream, this is a serious deconstruction of the genre. It makes it a little bit more obvious what a lot of people used to talk about in regards to the 80s slashers. As grotty and as fucked up as these movies were, they were very moral majority in terms of the victims. Everybody who got killed was either having sex or doing drugs, basically any form of sin.
Shut up.
The only people who ever survived to the end of these movies, as we all know, are virgins, which is a pretty ridiculous thing when you stop and think about it. This movie confronts that head on by taking out a natural slasher villain, which is usually just a human being killing a bunch of horny teenagers. This one is death itself, but it's spread like an STD. It makes the sexual metaphor in slasher films a lot more overt and puts it up front. The only way that you could get rid of this killer that keeps following you is if you have to have sex with somebody else, and then it's going to chase after that person. But if it gets to that person and it kills them, it's going to come back to you next. It plays itself very seriously, unlike Scream, and it has a great retro 80s vibe. Even though it takes place in the present time in the 2010s, the music, the score, the framing, the style of it all reek of the 1980s. Very intense movie. It was a fucking impressive debut film from David Robert Mitchell. Really impressive. And I love the monster in it. The fact that it could be anything from your life and the way that it just keeps following you very slowly, non-stop, relentlessly. So for me, 49 is It Follows from 2014.
Well, that's a good choice. I've never seen atmosphere quite like that.
In a slasher movie.
Yeah, the mixture of atmosphere and score, just completely original. I remember thinking it was so simple and stripped down, but like nothing I'd ever seen before. That's hard to do. My number 49 is another Tom Holland film, Fright Night from 1985. This one was both written and directed by Tom Holland. The standouts in this are Chris Sarandon once again, Roddy McDowall as Peter Vincent, and Stephen Jeffries as Evil Ed. He's a really standout and really scary makeup. Excellent and memorable makeup effects like that. Some of the effects are scary, some of them are campy, but they all work.
It's Rear Window with the supernatural element thrown into it.
Yeah, I love the spirit of it. It's another one of those that manages some real visceral scares while still being funny and campy throughout the whole thing. The instantly iconic makeup and the images from this, plus the spirit of it, is what made it my number 49, Fright Night.
I need to give that another rewatch because I watched it a couple times as a kid, but it was never something that stuck out in my mind. I'm curious to see how I would react to it with a rewatch years later. My number 48 is Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. And let me say something about this movie. It's not very enjoyable, and it's still in my top 50. And while there are more pleasurable and fun horror films, no other horror film scares me or gets under my skin as much as this one. It is so powerful, it's so overwhelming, it feels so realistic, and it emphasizes how mundane violence actually is. I would say it's a slasher movie, but it's a slasher movie that removes all the glamour from it. It removes the campiness, it removes the slick gore, it removes the inventive kills, and presents a serial killer as they actually are. Mundane, boring, average, ho-hum, not much of a personality. The movie itself, the way it's filmed, is so grainy that it doesn't even feel like you're watching a movie. It feels like you're just watching footage from the 1980s about a serial killer. And it was directed by John McNaughton. And originally, John McNaughton was a documentarian. He had not done narrative films before this one. And the topics that he usually covered in his documentaries were usually something very serious. A studio approached him and said that they would fund one of his movies, but it would have to be a slasher movie, because it was just something you could throw together really cheaply, and it's almost guaranteed a profit. So he delivered a slasher movie, but he put his own spin on it. He made it completely realistic. And I think that's why the film is so disturbing, is the way that it presents violence as so mundane and so casual. There's no build-up to it, there's no excitement, and it doesn't really seem to bring much pleasure or fulfillment to Henry's life. Henry is played by Michael Rooker. His partner is played by Tom Towles. And as bad as Michael Rooker is in the role of Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, and he's a really loathsome character, it's Tom Towles' character that really makes the movie disgusting on another level. Yeah. Because he's a degenerate. The way that he takes pleasure in the murder, the way that he takes pleasure in the torture, and the way that he attempts to rape his sister, knowing that this is all loosely based, but still based on an actual serial killer, gives it an extra air of authenticity. The first time I watched it, I was scared to even go outside at night. I was at a friend's house and I had to take an Uber home, and I ran up to the front door backwards, making sure nobody was watching me, and was unlocking the door from the back, watching everything from the street before jumping into my house frightened. While there's horror movies that I enjoy more, there's no way that I couldn't put the film that scared me the most into my top 50 horror movies. There's no way I could honestly do that as a serious horror fan. And for that reason, it is number 48 on my list.
Well, that's one of them you have to put in your list just because of the reaction you had to it, no matter, even if it's a bad reaction.
Yeah, I had a bad reaction. Like I said, I was kind of surprised that I put this in my top 50, but it didn't seem right not including it because no other film scares me like this one. So that just, I think, speaks to its quality and its effectiveness.
Well, my number 48 is from 2007. It's a little French film called Frontiers, written and directed by Xavier Gens. It's about a gang of thieves who flee Paris after political election turns violent, and they get stuck with a group of neo-Nazis. And this is one of those movies like The Devil's Rejects, which is a very clear homage to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where some victims get caught up with this sadistic family. But I think just like Devil's Rejects, this really takes it in an original direction. The characters that are involved in the family are really cool and original, especially the matriarch of the family. They torture their victims. And then this old man comes in his Nazi uniform. He's saying all these sadistic things to the people, and you see he's speaking in German, and you see the translation at the bottom. And then suddenly he starts yelling out these things in German, and you don't see the translation, and you just a chill runs up your spine because you can just imagine what he's saying to them.
Shut your mouth, or I'll rip your lips off.
So it's just little things like that. A lot of really cool visuals in it, but the real standout in this one is Karina Testa. She plays the main part, Yasmin. The main reason why this is at my number 48, even though it was all the way up 2007, is this actress right here. It's one of the best final girl performances that I've seen in a great many years. Flawed characters going into a situation like this. Like it's not a bunch of innocents. This is a gang of thieves, and you see them in a violent struggle at the beginning of it, and you see them trying to take advantage of this political upheaval, and then you end up rooting for them because they're being tortured by these people.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll stab your eardrums with an ice pick.
My number 47 film is Rob Reiner's adaptation of the Stephen King classic novel, Misery. And really what this comes down to for me is that the movie is good all around. It's very suspenseful, it's very involving, it's realistic and a little bit horrifying, but what really makes the movie, it cannot be overstated, is fucking Kathy Bates.
Yeah.
One of the truly great horror movie monsters ever put on screen. Stephen King is mostly known for his horror novels and for his horror fiction, but horror is not the only thing he's ever done. And every time that he's ever ventured away from horror or did something that was a little bit different, he's faced a lot of backlash. So this film is a little bit of a metaphor for that. It's about toxic fandom that only wants one thing from one thing from the person or the author that they love, and insisting that they get that one thing, and when they don't get it, they become enraged. They have a sense of entitlement. And I think it's still relevant to this day because a lot of fans of different films or franchises have a sense of entitlement as if they own the movies, as if the creator cannot change anything that they like about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what keeps this movie so fresh. Annie Wilkes, Kathy Bates Annie Wilkes, could be a metaphor for any toxic fan out on the internet. Obviously, it's very exaggerated. Most of these people are not monsters like that, but that's what's great about Stephen King. He takes the normal everyday situations and normal everyday things like toxic fandom and elevates them to the level of horror. And for that reason, it is number 47. The movie is just as good as the book, but in a completely different way.
Cool, and that's funny that that's your number 47, because my number 47 is also a Stephen King film. It's Silver Bullet from 1985. First of all, it's one of my favorite werewolf films, and the werewolf subgenre is way too scarce.
Confession before you proceed. I don't think any of my top 50 horror films is a werewolf movie.
This is the first of a few for mine. Based on the Stephen King novel, and he also wrote the screenplay. The obvious standouts in this one are, of course, Corey Haim, Gary Busey at his insane best, and Everett McGill from People Under the Stairs and also Twin Peaks. He played a great priest/werewolf in it. The things I loved about this was the sister's narration. Not only did it feel very Stephen King, it also made you feel very fearful for the Corey Haim character, because you think, if the sister's narrating this, then something really bad might happen to this little boy. I love the look of the werewolf.
It's always fun to watch Gary Busey act batshit.
It's some of his best here. And when you see, one of the most impressive things when it comes to Gary Busey on this one, when you see him go up against this werewolf and this werewolf is tossing him around the room, he did all his stunts. So every time you see him thrown through the air and slammed up against the wall, that's really Gary Busey. Maybe that rattled his head a little too much. He got much crazier after that. But this was directed by Daniel Adius, who only done this and a bunch of TV. I'm not sure why he didn't do any more movies. Corey Haim was adorable in it, and you loved him and rooted for him. And just an excellent werewolf story. And that's why Silver Bullet from 1985 is my number 47.
So my number 46 film is from 1963. It is Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. It's probably Alfred Hitchcock's most fun and visceral movie, one of the great monster movies of all time. And the special effects, while being a little bit dated, were way ahead of their time and still remain very effective despite some of the slight datedness of it. And like anything with Alfred Hitchcock, it just comes down to the craft of the film itself. Tippi Hedren is really good in the movie. Rod Taylor are really fun. But for a long time, the movie doesn't seem like it's a horror movie. There's a good section of the first 45 minutes or so when it seems like it might be a zippy romantic comedy. But once it turns into a horror film about birds, and it comes pretty unexpectedly too, it is fucking relentless from that point on.
Yeah.
Every bird attack is staged to optimal effect. Every minute of it is suspenseful. The bird attacks, some of it is a little bit outdated, like I said, but it still works despite that. And I think part of it is the way that it's edited, is that you see the birds attacking, you see quick flashes, the furious editing style makes it seem kind of chaotic, what you would imagine it would be like to be attacked by a swarm of birds. And it's just the concept itself is pretty original when you think of it in terms of monster movies. Who would ever make a bird a villain or a horror movie villain? Sharks, you would think that makes sense as a horror villain, even a big fucking dog like Cujo, but birds. And it's what makes that even more effective is that if birds in real life decided to turn on the human species, they would fucking tear us apart and we would not stand a chance against them. And I love all the little animatronic birds when they're pecking at people. There's one particular scene when you see an old man's eyeballs that were pecked out. This is 1963. It still looks pretty graphic and disturbing when you look at it. A lot of tense moments. The acting is really solid. And it's just, Alfred Hitchcock was just one of the great filmmakers. The way that he drew suspense out, the way that he built it up. I love the scene when Tippi Hedren is sitting outside the school and she looks over to the playground and she sees one bird on the bars of something.
Oh yeah.
And then every time you hear the kid's singing and it's very quiet and it slowly starts to build suspense. Every time she looks back, there's a few more birds and the kids keep singing and singing and there's no other sound, just the wind going down. And then she looks more and more and more until there's like a giant set of birds that are just surrounding the playground.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely terrifying. You put yourself in that position like, what the fuck would you do if you saw all those birds right there and you knew they were ready to attack? Would you try to get out? Would you try to save the kids? Would you try to warn them?
Yeah.
Just fucking phenomenally filmed suspense scenes.
Could you imagine what a challenge it must have been at that time to do all those bird effects? Because
In 1963,
bird effects are hard to do now.
I can only imagine what they were like over half a century ago.
Between rustling around real birds and then putting realistic ones in there, I mean, you could tell now that it's fake, but you can see how it looked very realistic at the time.
I think, like I said, the editing style still helps it because sometimes it feels so chaotic that you don't get a good chance to look at all the birds attacking at once. It just assaults your senses too fast. In the same way that Hitchcock edited the shower scene in Psycho. Great film. Number 46, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds.
My number 46 is The Lost Boys from 1987, one of my all-time favorite vampire films. Directed by Joel Schumacher, and often I think, how did the director of Batman and Robin direct something as great as Lost Boys? But I remember he also directed 8mm, Falling Down, and Flatliners, which were all good films. And it was written by two fairly unknown writers, along with Jeffrey Boehm, who wrote The Dead Zone, Lethal Weapon 1, 2, and 3, and Indiana Jones. And the standouts in this are, of course, Kiefer Sutherland as the main vampire, Diane Wiest as the mom, Jason Patric, the Frog Brothers.
The Coreys.
Yeah, both Coreys were in this one. Their Maggots Michael scene, the sexy sax man on stage, the awesome soundtrack. The vampires were vicious and the design of them looked really cool. Their lair looked cool and scary. I remember watching this at the time in 1987, and when I first watched it, I knew I was watching a classic. Just every frame of it is just iconic and memorable and fun.
It has a good spirit to it. What I find interesting about The Lost Boys is it does something that Twilight actually tried to do. Because Twilight was a vampire movie, which I'm not a fan of. I'm not a fan of that series in general. That tried to make the leads, the vampires, a little bit sexy, a little bit mysterious. There was a little bit of the vampire as a teen heartthrob.
Yeah.
That element is still present in The Lost Boys, but they tackle it without sacrificing the brutality and the viciousness of vampires. Because in The Lost Boys, for all of the teen glamour and for all of it, and part of it does feel like a teen flick, it doesn't sacrifice in terms of the gore. And the vampires are still cool. They're vicious. They're alluring. They're maybe even a little bit romantic. But you get to see them for what they are, as fucking monsters.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the great successes of The Lost Boys, is it manages to do the teen heartthrob vampire angle without sacrificing any of the horror, the brutality.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
We are now to my number 45, is from 2017, Gerald's Game, directed by the great Mike Flanagan,
Okay.
and adapted from the Stephen King novel. Right at the bat, I always really liked this book a lot. I had read it a long time ago, but it's written in such a literary way that I couldn't picture it being filmed as a movie. And it was a problem for decades of people who wanted to take Gerald's Game and adapt it. It just didn't seem like it would work as a piece of cinema because of the way the story is told. So I was actually really skeptical of this movie when I went in to see it. And holy shit, it fucking blew me away. I was gobsmacked by the fact that it was a very faithful adaptation of Stephen King's novel. It feels very true to what Gerald's Game is. But what's interesting about that is what made Gerald's Game such a great book is the literary elements of it. This managed to take that story and adapt it to cinematic language, which was enough to actually blow me away. And if that had been all it did, just adapted to acceptable cinematic language, I just would have been impressed with that on its own. That would have been enough. But it goes even further than that. This film is nerve-wrackingly suspenseful. It builds up a sense of dread the entire time. It's nail-biting. It's not very violent. it doesn't really, it's very psychological. There's no supernatural, actually there is a small supernatural element too, but I'm not going to reveal what it is. But it's mostly one actress, Carla Gugino, who is just stuck in one room, chained to a bed, while her husband lies dead in front of her. And she's stuck there with nothing but her mind to feed on itself. And you get to go through an emotional journey with her. Through the horrors of being stuck in a very bad situation, she is forced to confront her past. She has to face childhood trauma that she's always pushed down, that she's always pushed off to the side, and use it, confront it, and use that as a source of strength to fucking get out of a situation that seems unwinnable. Great lead performance from Carla Gugino. Mike Flanagan did a fucking incredible job of turning something unfilmable and making it cinematic and exciting, and I like that it's emotionally layered. The subject matter that lies at the heart of the film is very heavy, but it's done in a way that's very tasteful and respectful and dignified. The one scene that it does have of gore is so fucking effective. It had me wincing the first time I saw it. I was like, oh my god, are they actually doing that?
Love Mike Flanagan, and I'm sure that movie is why he got Dr. Sleep. So my number 45 is one that a lot of people probably haven't heard of. It's Plague Town from 2008. This is directed and co-written by David Gregory, who's done mostly just documentaries and documentary shorts. It's co-written by John Cregan, who is the editor on a lot of David Gregory's documentaries. So for some reason, this documentary director and this editor got together and they decided to make this campy little movie. Very low budget. It's about a broken family, a broken American family who visits Ireland to get back to their roots. And they stumble upon a group of mutant children. And then they find out that the family that the children belong to tries to breed with the family to purify their bloodline. I don't know what made these guys think that they could make a movie, but they didn't know how to color correct. It's not color corrected properly. Some of the acting falls flat, but it almost seems like the bad acting is part of these people's personality. It's like a broken family, and then the more they fight, the better their acting is. You care just enough about them to where you feel bad for them when they started getting attacked by these mutant children in this mutated family. I love the girl with the bandages over her eyes. It's a girl, they've gone through so much inbreeding that this beautiful girl is the best that they've done so far, but she was born without eyes. So they put a bandage around her eyes and take one of their victims' eyes who they had gouged out and adhere them to the outside of the bandage so she looks freaky.
I did see this movie at your house. I was drunk though.
Yeah.
So I really don't remember this very well, but I do know I saw it in an inebriated state of mind.
But I recognize it's like a cheap little movie and it's really low budget, and I'm actually very proud that the person who done the sound on this movie did the sound for Stab Awake, my first film. So I'm very proud of that because I absolutely love this movie. There's something really special about it. As cheap and low budget as it is, some of the scenes are genuinely fucking scary. I don't even understand how they achieve this atmosphere with it being this, visibly cheap, and still manage to make a really scary and entertaining movie. So I think more people should watch Plague Town from 2008. It's an excellent little movie, and we may never ever get one like it again.
So my number 44 is Creep from 2014. Now, the reason Creep is my number 44 is, one, it's my favorite found footage movie of all time, and the one that strikes me as the most plausible and realistic. Whenever I watch it, I don't feel like I'm watching a movie. I'm feeling like I'm watching real footage of somebody actually being stalked. And of course, because Mark Duplass has the role of a lifetime as the creep. We never really do get his name clarified in the movie.
Yeah.
The first time I saw this movie, I was absolutely blown away. I found it kind of inspiring because it's done with a very low budget, very minimal, but man, it wrings so much fucking awkward tension out of its premise. It's about a videographer who answers an ad to come and film a man who claims that he's dying of cancer. And he wants him to film him and document him so he can give this video to his unborn child, so he'll have some kind of token of his father, something to remember him by. Obviously, it's all bullshit, and I don't think that's a spoiler. I think it's pretty obvious from the very front that it's completely nonsense. But man, Mark Duplass, who actually co-wrote and produced the movie, has a fucking ball playing the creep of the movie. Because he's really awkward, he's kind of funny, he's overly friendly, and at first, even though you could tell that there's something off, you could understand to a very limited extent why this guy would stick around him for so long, because you think maybe he's just a weirdo, or maybe he's just, meaningless, well-meaning, harmless guy. But the more it goes on, the more the situations become uncomfortable, the odder he starts acting, and once it reaches a certain point, it starts to become relentlessly intense. Everything about it felt real, or felt like something that could happen in it. I love the ending of the movie. This is another one of those horror movies that has hardly any gore or violence in it, but the one violent scene at the end that it does have is really effective. And of course, you gotta love the peach fuzz mask.
Yeah.
Yes, that wolf that Mark Duplass dresses up as, and I love his little that song that he always sings. I might look like a big bad wolf.
Yeah.
But I'm as friendly as a rabbit.
Yeah.
I also love the sequel too. The sequel is it's a fucking awesome follow-up and a good continuation of the storyline. But for me,
Tubby Time,
yes. And there's so much awkward, dark comedy in this movie that I find really appealing, because it's still a little fun, even though it feels kind of real when you're watching it. I just love this movie. I've seen it dozens of times already, and I love how effective it is in its very short amount of time. It has a very limited runtime, but not a second of the movie is wasted. And another thing that I like about it is that in some of the weaker found footage movies, one of my biggest criticisms of the weaker ones is that they tend to fall on the found footage aspect as an excuse for shoddy camera work, bad cinematography, or lazy editing while it's found footage. This one manages to have actually really good cinematography in it, even though it's still believable enough that somebody was just walking around filming it. I'm thinking in particular of the cover of the movie, the scene where the videographer is all the way at the bottom of the steps, and he has the camera pointed up at Mark Duplass. And it's nighttime, you see the light behind him, and all you see is just his silhouette against this big light. It's shot so eerily and so creepily, the way that just the framing and the composition of it, but it never breaks the reality of the film. It never makes you feel like it was designed to be that way. It just is. So it has very good cinematography, especially considering what they were going for.
I love that it's very stripped down horror. Just two guys in one location. Very stripped down. And I'm also, the thing I was impressed with the most, and the only reason why I like one better than two, is I thought maybe, just maybe, he was a harmless guy all the way up till that shocking ending. All the way until the impact.
But then you think about it after, it was so fucking obvious the entire time.
Exactly.
I like Creep 2 roughly about as much as 1, and it could have made, but the original one has a slight edge on it for me. Also, I think it was the first time seeing it.
Yeah.
By the time the second one starts, you already know it's confirmed he's a serial killer, and you've already seen him kill. So it's a completely different dynamic. Excellent movie, but for my money, Creep is a little bit more effective as a horror movie than Creep 2 is.
It's a little more horror than the second one. And it's funny that 44 was a found footage on your list, because my number 44 is also a found footage film. REC2 from 2009.
How does this keep happening, these matchups?
Yeah.
Perfect.
This impressed me most because it was better than part one. I didn't think found footage film could get any more visceral, any more realistic than REC, any more scary, but this one actually achieved it. This one is also directed and co-written by Jaume Balguero and Paco Plaza. It's a Spanish found footage film. And in this one picks up after the events of the first one, where it's people quarantined in an apartment building and there's some type of rage virus going around. And in this one we find out that it's not a rage virus, it's supernatural. So it ups the scare factor, because you realize that these aren't just infected people, these are possessed demons. And then it's even more of a threat, because your life isn't just threatened now, your soul is threatened. Mm-hmm. And this, more than most movies I've seen, puts you in the place of the people in it. It's so realistic, and for it to introduce this supernatural element, it never losing its realism, is one of the most impressive things about it for me. It's visceral and pure realistic scares, and one of the very best found footage films I've ever seen.
I have to confess very sadly that I have not seen REC or REC 2. I have seen Quarantine, the American remake, and I enjoyed it. And the reason I haven't seen REC is because every copy I found of it when I've tried to stream it every time has been dubbed in English. I hate that shit. It gets on my fucking nerves, and I will wait until I can actually see it the right way. I'm going to watch it in Spanish. I'm not going to watch a fucking dubbed movie.
Yeah, if it's dubbed, it'll take you right out of it, because that's half of the realism right there.
Yeah, so.
I actually watched Quarantine first and thought it was a very good movie, and Jennifer Carpenter is very good in it. Quarantine is almost a shot-for-shot remake. It almost looks the same, but there's something just grittier and nastier about REC, and it's even more realistic. And there are a couple times during Quarantine that you're kind of taken out of the movie, but you're completely immersed in it in REC.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
My number 43 is Tales from the Hood, directed by Rusty Cundiff from 1995. It's my favorite anthology horror film of all time. I won't make the argument that it's the best, because we can debate about that until the end of time, but it's my personal favorite. The way it blends fantastic supernatural horror with real-life horrors, and the way that it injects a sense of playfulness and provocative social commentary makes it a standout in the horror subgenre, in the horror genre for me. I've always had a blast with this movie. I watch it pretty much almost every Halloween time. It never gets old. It's always fun. I love each story as its own thing. My favorite story in the movie, though, is probably about the dolls, the little dolls that are possessed by the souls of slaves.
Yeah.
It's interesting that they're on a plantation, and the house on top of the plantation is owned by somebody who is running for Senate in the South on a deeply racist platform. And so the dolls come back and they haunt him and they fuck with him and they kind of punish him for his ignorance and his racism. Another one of the good stories is about domestic violence in the house. It's about a little boy who has magical powers. When he can draw whatever he's afraid of and crumple the paper up, he can destroy it. Another good story involves police brutality. Another one involves gang violence. And that's what I love about this movie. It takes real life horrors that people deal with on a daily basis, stuff that would be horrifying just on its own, and it injects it with actual supernatural horror, more theatrical horror. It's a perfect blend of the realistic and the fantastic, and I love how it uses the horror genre as a form of social commentary. Overall, really love Tales from the Hood. My favorite anthology film, the one that I have the most fun with, and the one that I could rewatch the most. And of course, because Clarence William, as the sort of crypt keeper character who just says the shit over and over, is priceless.
All right, my number 43 is a fairly new one from 2011, The Cabin in the Woods, directed and co-written by Drew Goddard and co-written by Joss Whedon.
That almost made my list. It was like 2 or 3 down. Yeah,
well, I love this because it's familiar elements that we've seen in a lot of other horror films, but it was portrayed its optimum best, I think. It's a great representation of all these different types of horror films, all thrown into one, with other completely original things thrown in, like people behind the scenes kind of pulling the strings, while you see familiar characters that you've seen in horror films go through familiar situations with familiar monsters. And then what it ends up being is just a monster free-for-all. And one of the things I love about it most is I remember watching it, and I absolutely loved it, and I was on a high after watching it, and I watched it again. And after watching it twice, one of my only complaints was that there was too much CGI. And then I find out that there's almost no CGI. You have this, especially that big scene where all the monsters rush into this one room. There was like 2, maybe 3 monsters that were CGI monsters kind of weaved in there. Everyone else was created by the makeup department, which was led by David Leroy Anderson, who is Heather Langenkamp's husband. and she also worked on this as well. And it's again almost all practical effects when it looks CGI, and it's a very interesting play on typical horror characters, where they have the jock acts like a douchey jock because he's given the suggestion to act like that.
The slut character acts extra slutty. The virgin acts extra virginal. The jokester, which is the pothead in this case, is extra ridiculous and extra over the top.
Yes.
It takes basically what Scream did with the as a send up of the slasher subgenre, but takes what Scream did a step further and throws in extra layers of insanity on top of it all.
And it gives you memorable characters to root for as the main protagonists, and it also gives you cool characters behind the scenes, compelling characters. Because the main characters in the front are Kristen Connolly as Dana, Chris Hemsworth, one of his first films, as Kurt, Fran Kranz as Marty, that's the stoner, and Richard Jenkins and Bradley Whitford were amazing as the duo behind the scenes that were kind of pulling the strings on all this.
I think it's just one of the funnest horror movies I've ever seen. And it's one that almost made my list, but I do fucking love it, and it's totally worthy of a top 50.
Dana ends up becoming the perfect final girl, and she as the perfect virginal final girl, and that's the cliche she's supposed to be. And then she goes beyond that. And then the stoner character, Marty, is the perfect cliche stoner character, and he goes beyond that by the end. The writing was really clever and ballsy. One of the best horror films of the last 20 years.
Excellent choice, Michael.
My number 43.
My number 42 is from 1994, In the Mouth of Madness from John Carpenter.
Ooh.
It's easily John Carpenter's most surreal movie. It's a mindfuck that plunges the viewer into John Trent, that would be Sam Neill, his maddening and delirious state of mind. This movie really took a long time to get its due because, like a lot of John Carpenter's work, when it came out, it wasn't very appreciated and it actually got slammed by a lot of critics. If you ever go back and read this, it was incoherent.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't make sense. Even it didn't do well at the box office, but since then it's aged into a cult classic and its reputation has gone up a lot. And for me, it remains one of John Carpenter's very best works of art. As far as horror movies go, it's probably his most unique of horror films, because if you think about something like Halloween, which is a fucking masterpiece,
yeah,
that's more done in a more traditional horror sense, where it's about the boogeyman, good versus evil facing off. The Thing, which is sci-fi horror, which is kind of a splatter film, where it's this external villain. This one, there is no real villain. It's just the mind itself is where the horror comes from. It's a really good trip into the unconscious mind. And I know for a lot of people, it's kind of a maddening experience to watch, because there's sometimes when the movie doesn't really make complete sense. But I think it's done in the best way possible, because it plunges you into John Trent's state of mind. Sam Neill plays a private investigator, and they're looking into the disappearance of an author named Sutter Kane. And Sutter Kane is basically a parody of Stephen King. When even you see the books, copies of his books, it's done, his name is printed in the Stephen King font that you see in all of his books from that era. And the concept is that anybody who starts reading his work eventually goes mad. Obviously, John Trent starts to read his work in order to track him down, and he starts to go fucking completely insane. I also think the movie's kind of funny, too.
Yeah.
I don't think it gets enough credit for that, is that as horrifying and as surreal as it is, this movie just has some fucking laugh out loud moments. There are like a couple of scenes whenever I watch it, I have to actually pause because it makes me laugh so fucking hard.
Shut up.
And Sam Neill, of course, he's just a god in the horror genre as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, he is.
So for me, it's just a movie that you could watch over and over again, and every time you watch it, you see different things, you notice different details. And because it's such a unique film, I think there's a part of it that it was always destined to be a bomb when it came out. These types of films are not movies that the general public can just lap up one time and have a coherent response to it. It takes time, multiple viewings, perspective for a movie's greatness like this to actually seep in. And I'm glad it's finally come around to finally getting the respect it deserves. Even then, I still feel it's an underrated horror movie, and I think it's one of the highlights of John Carpenter's career. It's definitely his most ballsy movie. It's his most audacious film. And what's impressive about it is how ambitious it actually is, what it sets out to do, the state of mind that it sets to induce in the viewer.
I mean, I supported it at the time. I did my part.
It
felt very personal to me because hardly anybody else liked it like I did.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
My number 42 is Jaws from 1975, directed by the great Steven Spielberg.
Fantastic choice, Michael.
It was based on a novel by Peter Benchley, and it was written by Carl Gottlieb, who went on to write Jaws 2 and 3 and The Jerk with Steve Martin. This stars Roy Scheider, Robert Shaw, and Richard Dreyfuss in a movie that's like an acting class. Roy Scheider plays the sheriff, Robert Shaw plays his old seafarer, and Richard Dreyfuss plays a marine biologist. The background of these characters is woven into their performances, and it's woven into the writing so perfectly, where they feel that, Roy Scheider feels like the sheriff, and Robert Shaw feels like an old seafarer.
What do you think about the debate about Jaws in the horror community? Because some people would like to argue that it's not a horror film, and I've always been completely against that idea.
I think that's ridiculous. I mean, just look at the opening scene. That's one of the greatest horror scenes in history. That girl in the water and her feeling something nipping at her feet
and slowly being pulled down. Really get chills every time you see it. For me, this movie is a masterpiece. It is the perfect commercial piece of filmmaking. What I really like about it is the way that it builds suspense. It is up there with some of Hitchcock's very best suspense films in terms of how it makes your heart race, how it makes you panic. The last time I watched it, I actually jumped a few times. Even though I knew certain scenes were coming, I actually jumped back and freaked out. There are so many scenes in the movie that have me on the edge of my seat that are really tense. The scene at the dock, when they're trying to capture Jaws and the dock is just slowly falling apart and they're trying to run away from it. Always leaves my heart racing every time I seen it. Scene for scene, it is just an impeccably crafted film. Yeah. The moment that when you see the little boy who gets attacked, which is actually pretty shocking when you think about it, because everybody associates Steven Spielberg with family-friendly films. Yeah. That was a pretty brutal attack on a little kid, where you just see his body just flop up. Obviously, he's being dragged away. And just in the water, just a bunch of blood just spurting everywhere. And of course, those POV camera angles of the shark as you see it zeroing in on his victim, zeroing in on the little boy.
And how could you not consider that horror? It's frightening, and there's a perpetual state of anxiety that the movie keeps you in throughout.
The entire runtime has your heart pumping out of your chest.
So you're already kind of tense, and then when the jump scares come, it makes them even more, they're not accentuated by a lot of music. The music comes in the setup.
Yes.
So it's the actual scares that are scaring you. It's the the music helps the scare build up, but the scare just speaks for itself every time. It just gets me every time, even watching it 30, 40 years later.
Do you think it is John Williams' most recognizable motif? Because I know Star Wars is another big one as far as his scores go, but there's something about Jaws that is so simple and elemental that all you hear is the dun. Yeah. Everybody automatically thinks of sharks when they hear that. Yeah. And how brilliant is it? It's only 2 notes, isn't it?
Yeah.
1 or 2 notes, that's all. Dun.
Just speeds them up.
And it just speeds them up. So fucking perfect. It's a movie that defined a generation. It scared a whole generation of people from visiting the beach. After Jaws came out, beach attendance at the beaches actually went down.
Yeah, The Exorcist is one of the most notorious films in history as far as frightening the audience, and this is right up there.
As far as frightening the audience, definitely.
Yeah, this scared the shit out of everyone. I was around, I was a little kid when this movie came out, so I remember how crazy everyone went. And my little brother is still, he's in his 40s, he's like 44 now, and he's still scared to death of sharks.
Because of this movie?
Yeah, he won't even go near a lake because of this movie.
Oh, wow.
And the last time he went in the water, we were in the Great Lakes up in Illinois when we were little. Mm-hmm. He stepped in the water for the first time after seeing that movie. It'd been a couple years since he'd seen the movie. He stepped into that water, and all I did was dun dun. He ran out of the water. He's never been back.
That's all it took. Do you feel bad about that?
I do feel kind of bad, but it's Jaws' fault.
So yeah,
but just the opening scene is amazing.
Yes,
it
is.
The suspense throughout, the jump scares, the phenomenal acting and writing, the music, the effects, the shit that they had to go through to get that shark to work is an animatronic shark that hardly worked through the whole thing, but it still looks fucking real to this day.
No CGI, that's why.
Yeah. And it's still undeniably the quintessential killer shark film. There's not been one made that even comes close to Jaws.
My number 41 is Maniac from 1980, directed by William Lustig. Mm-hmm. For me, this is, as far as those typical 80s slasher movies go, this is the most effective one. What makes it effective is that a lot of the slasher movies from the 80s that I love them in a very campy, fun way. You put them on, you see a bunch of teenagers getting slaughtered, there's something giggly about it, you don't take it too seriously. This removes all the cheesiness, all the camp away from the slasher movie and replaces it with a raw, unfiltered sense of realism, and it's very, very harsh. It's gritty as fuck. It has that look, that style, that aesthetic that I love. Even though it was made in it's an 80s film technically, it was shot in the 70s, and it has that look of 1970s cinema, the grittiness, the dirtiness, the way that New York is shot in the way that New York looked in the 70s and 80s. And of course, you gotta love Joe Spinell in the lead role, because most slasher movies of the era, they're all either masked killers or they have some kind of gimmick. This guy has no gimmick. He's just a regular person hiding in plain sight. He has no mask, and he's pathetic and almost contemptible.
Yeah.
And that's a really unusual thing to do with a slasher movie villain. It takes all the glamour out of the slasher and replaces it with something a little bit more raw and realistic. I also think it's very suspensefully frightening. And it's I can understand that this movie was very controversial at its time, and it still is controversial, and I think it always will be, because the killer is very obviously very misogynistic and is mostly taking his anger out on women, and you get to see his childhood as he grows up, that he has a lot of anger towards his mom, so he associates a lot of women with being like his mom. So he strangles them, he scalps them, and then he has this weird thing where he has all these mannequins around his room in his little apartment, and he just decorates it with women's body parts, and it's pretty fucking ugly and disturbing.
Yeah.
But it's the movie that most made me understand a lot of the fears that my female friends tell me about. How a lot of my female friends will tell me that they make sure to park really close if they're parking somewhere at night, if they have to leave, so they don't have to walk too far for their car. They don't like walking down like empty streets at night with nobody around. And the scene where the young nurse knows that there's a killer on the loose and realizes that she might be being followed by him as she's running through the New York subways is so tense and is so frightening. It actually made me understand that the fears that some women have to live through. Overall, this is not going to be for most people because it's such a fucking punishing, unrelenting film. It's really ugly and it rubs your face in its nastiness, but fuck is it effective. And of course, Tom Savini's makeup effects all just help to make it even better.
Yeah.
All the brutality in this movie looks fairly realistic, and we can mostly thank Tom Savini for that, who's actually in the movie and gets his head blown off too.
Yeah.
And I also think what heightened my appreciation for this was the opportunity to see it on the big screen, which we both did at the Egyptian Theater in LA.
Yeah.
With William Lustig in attendance and getting to speak to him after. He's like the nicest, sweetest guy. He's super friendly, really cool, very encouraging. Maniac, one of the very, very best slasher films, at least in my opinion. 1980, director William Lustig.
And not to mention one of the great movie posters ever created. It's on our wall of our studio here.
Yes, it is.
All right, my number 41 is from the great Danny Boyle, 28 Days Later from 2002. It was written by Alex Garland, who went on to write and direct Ex Machina and Annihilation.
Woohoo!
The standouts in this are Cillian Murphy, of course, as the star, and Naomi Harris, and of course Christopher Eccleston, who was in Danny Boyle's first movie, Shallow Grave, which I love.
That's an excellent movie.
And in this movie, you see some activists trying to release some monkeys from a lab at the beginning of it, and the monkeys end up being infected with some type of rage virus. So then they're let loose by the activists and then attack, and then suddenly you see 28 days later, London has been wiped out, and Cillian Murphy's character wakes up out of a coma and starts walking the streets of London, and everyone is gone. So then he gets attacked by a horde of zombies, of infected zombies. He meets some other survivors, and he tries to survive with them, and there's a lot of social commentary about the savage nature of humans, which always is good in a zombie film.
Zombie movies always have some form of social commentary in it. Even The Walking Dead. It seems like it's a tradition that Romero started that you can't really break.
The best ones do, and that's why I think the Dawn of the Dead remake was a failure, because it took out all of that social commentary out of the zombie
and turned
lore.
it into a video game.
Yeah, exactly. I love the abandoned London parts on this. It's realistic effects on only an $8 million budget, and you can tell they went through a lot to achieve this effect. They had the police slow traffic for the shot of London completely empty. They had the police slow down traffic on each side. And then they put 10 cameras throughout the streets, and those 10 cameras tried to catch any empty space they could. They would film at 4 a.m., and then they would close the roads down for about an hour. And then they knew that would anger the motorists, so they sent out attractive women, and one of them was Danny Boyle's daughter. They sent him out into traffic,
exploiting his daughter to get a movie made. Shame.
To ease the minds of the drivers and get them to wait there for an hour.
I mean, it's a tactic that works. Can't deny that.
And the infected, they were really scary, really effective, and I found out they moved like they do because they were all athletes. Danny Boyle made sure to hire athletes as the infected because
the physicality he wanted to throw into his take on zombies.
Yeah, if our bodies were ravaged by something like that, they would move in unnatural ways.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it made them more frightening. Like when you see most other zombie movies, when you see a horde of zombies, you're like, oh shit, let's run and hide somewhere from these zombies. But when you see the infected, oh shit, you better fucking run, because they're full speed ahead, coming at you like a rabid dog, you know. Mm-hmm. I don't subscribe to the debate on whether these are zombies or not. Of course, they're different from what Romero created. I mean, he didn't create zombies.
He created a very specific brand of zombies, and people forget that zombies actually predate George Romero.
Yeah.
It's just his version is what defines zombies in modern pop culture. But if you think of old movies like I Walked with the Zombie or White Zombie, zombies just used to be reanimated corpses. They weren't necessarily there to eat you, or they didn't hunger for brains, and they were a little bit more supernatural. Just corpses that were walking around.
Yeah.
Trying to. In a way, Frankenstein is kind of a zombie, isn't he?
Yeah.
In a way. I'm not going to go. I know. Down that debate route.
And then a movie like this makes a zombie outbreak seem more plausible. Mm-hmm. Because zombies before were like the dead that got up out of their graves and walking around through some kind of nuclear waste spill or something like that, some kind of outside influence, like made these dead people alive. But this one, it takes our own fear of disease and turns it against us and makes us become rabid animals.
Interesting that your 41 is 28 days later. My 40 is actually Day of the Dead. George Romero, 1985. I feel that this is Romero's most underrated film. It has the perfect blend of social commentary, human drama, and relentlessly nasty gore effects. And like the last film on my list was also, the makeup was done by Tom Savini, one of the absolute legends of the industry.
Yeah.
I think that this film might be his greatest achievement as far as makeup effects go. They took what was great about Dawn of the Dead, and I love Dawn of the Dead, and just to be clear, Dawn of the Dead is not on my list, and I know more people actually would probably prefer that to Day of the Dead, and I chose to go with this one because this one was always spoken to me a little bit more. But I feel like it takes all the good gore effects that Tom Savini was doing in Dawn of the Dead and takes them to the next level in Day of the Dead. It's gooier, it's even more realistic, it's more squishy. The zombies look more naturally discolored, and it has the best feasting scene in any zombie movie, at least in my opinion, is when one of the military men is on the floor and he's slowly being ripped apart by all of the zombies at once, and you see his guts coming out and you see his limbs being ripped apart while he's still screaming and still alive.
Yeah.
So fucking effective and so brutal to this very, very day. I like it's kind of a blueprint for The Walking Dead.
Yeah.
In a way, I feel like this is the one that most influences The Walking Dead because it takes the concept that The Walking Dead did and ran with for seasons, that during a zombie apocalypse, the real monsters would be human beings, because zombies are uncontrollable. It's not their fault that they're zombies. They're just going around being themselves, what they're programmed to do. People will rise up and exploit that situation to their benefit. And this movie illustrates how, if the military got involved, how they would control it to try to manipulate a lot of things to their will. And I also like that it showed the evolution of zombies in this movie. It's the same universe that Romero started in A Night of the Living Dead in 1968. So this is like 17 years after that. And you see the progression of zombies as a species separate from human, with the character who's a doctor who actually starts teaching a zombie to react to music. And you see that the zombie actually starts reacting to music, starts listening to commands and expressing emotion. And you come to feel for the zombie in a way. And one of the best, most satisfying parts of the movie is when the main villain, who is just a military man, is being chased down by the zombie who he's been kind of torturing, comes up and shoots him. The zombie actually shoots the guy.
Yeah.
Very interesting take. And you can tell George Romero took the concept of the zombie evolution even further in Land of the Dead in the 2000s. But this to me was the pinnacle of George A. Romero's gory version of zombies. The best one. Night of the Living Dead is still my favorite George Romero movie and still my favorite zombie movie, but this one has the best looking zombies in any George Romero film, in my view, and it has just some of the best makeup effects ever put into a horror film, thanks to Tom Savini's awesome work.
Yeah, his whole series of the Dead movies are just fascinating to watch, because he took this folklore that existed before and made it mainstream and made it huge and just introduced a new element to it. And then you watch through the movies, you watch his own creation evolve.
Yes.
And you really see it in Day of the Dead.
And for that reason, Day of the Dead is number 40 on my list. For me, it's Romero's most underrated of the zombie movies, where Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead get a lot of love, deservedly so. But I feel like this one is every bit as good, and for me, a little better than Dawn of the Dead.
My number 40 is one of the greatest slasher films ever made, Black Christmas from 1974. It's also one of the first.
Great choice.
Directed by Bob Clark, who also directed Porky's and Christmas Story.
What's his stuff with Christmas movies?
I know. And A Christmas Story is kind of scary, too. And it's written by Ray Moore. It's actually a Canadian film.
Roy Moore?
I don't think it's
the Alabama senator pedophile. Well, he's not a senator. I know. I just that always makes me laugh when I see it now. I see written by Roy Moore. I was like, ugh.
Yeah.
Wrong Roy Moore though.
It's a Canadian film, and the big standout in this is, of course, Olivia Hussey as Jess. And I remember her from Romeo and Juliet. Before that, I used to love that movie. I still love that movie to this day. She was Juliet. And of course, Margot Kidder as Barb. And the great
Margot Robbie on the brain.
I know. And the great John Saxon as Lieutenant Ken Fuller. It's about it's a movie about a killer is on the loose in a sorority during Christmas break, and he taunts the girls over the phone with these ominous phone calls.
Very obscenely ominous phone calls.
Oh yeah, and I read that it was the director Bob Clark was feeding the lines to the actresses during that part, and they were actually really toned down for them. So they were reacting to things that weren't really that bad, and they put the really depraved things in post. So that
makes sense.
As far as movies with a sense of dread, this is one of the best, I think. There's a sense of dread throughout the whole thing, and then the acting and the POV camera shots and the music and everything kind of adds to that sense of dread and just kind of piles on and just makes you feel like a slow panic throughout, like something could happen at any minute.
You know how this is one of the templates of the slasher film and it inspired a lot? Don't you feel it's a little bit more mature than most of the slasher movies that came in its wake or came after it? They don't seem to have this sense of dread. They're more meant to be campy and fun. Yeah. This one is a very serious movie about its suspense and what it's trying to achieve.
Well, the director, Bob Clark, actually made a conscious decision to tone down the deaths scenes from the script. I guess in the script they were much more brutal. Mm-hmm. But in the movie, he decided to make them more subtle, more subtle as to what you see on camera, to where leave the most disturbing parts, the most gory parts
to the imagination.
And I think that's why it was so effective, and that's why it's effective to this day. Where if they would have went, the traditional slasher, which how could they be traditional slasher? They were one of the first. But after that, they became much more concentrating on the kills. Mm-hmm. And then I think this was a big inspiration for Halloween, right?
Yes, it was.
Because it had the same type of
sense of dread, suspense. And I think Halloween took it even further and perfected it even more so. But this was the template. This and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which both came out the same year.
Yeah, and the killer POV thing had been done in Peeping Tom a few years before, but to the greatest effect on this one, and really popularized that type of camera's perspective. I love the suffocation scene. I'll never forget that. That's why they put it on the cover of the movie. All the character interactions are really cool. You can tell that everybody in the cast kind of got along and were...
Margot Kidder is my favorite part of this movie.
Oh, yeah.
As a loudmouth, drunken, kind of vulgar, just does not give a fuck attitude.
Yeah.
Always cracks me up. Because there's always that girl like that at the sorority.
Yeah. Everybody else is taking it so hard, and she's just like, she don't give a fuck.
And that's why she gets what happens to her. She doesn't take it seriously.
But I read that they were going to play this as a primetime movie on NBC. And the only thing that kept it from airing was a string of murders that happened right when it was about to air, and come to find out they were Ted Bundy murders.
Which I'm sure the public wasn't aware who it was at the time.
Yeah. So Ted Bundy actually stopped Black Christmas from airing on TV. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if I got wind of this story somehow, but it was around this time. It was, I think it was later, like 77 or 78. I was in school, and I believe it was kindergarten or first grade. I wrote a story about a girl who was in a house, and this guy kept calling her and taunting her. So then she started calling the cops, and they traced the call, and then they called her up in a panic. They said, "We traced the call. It's coming from your house."
It's also the premise of When a Stranger Calls, too.
Yeah, and I was a little kid. I had never seen any of these movies. And it was so realistic and so graphic that the principal called my parents into the school and asked them if I had ever witnessed a murder. So that's one of the reasons why this is so special to me. Like when I finally saw it, I was like, "Holy shit! That's my story that I wrote when I was a little kid." But it's another one that stands up on repeat viewings. I never get tired of it. I seen it as my birthday movie last year.
Yes.
On the big screen. That was nice to see it on the big screen after all these years. So that's why that's number 40 for me. Black Christmas, the great slasher from 1974.
Love that one. My number 39 is Eyes Without a Face. This is a 1960 French film directed by Georges Franju. And again, I apologize for butchering the foreign names. I love this movie because it is both achingly beautiful and totally macabre and ghastly at the same time. The premise revolves around a young woman whose face is irreparably damaged. Her father is a doctor, a surgeon to be more exact, and he wants to restore his daughter's beauty. So what he does is he lures women in to his mansion, finds different ways to lure them there. Once he traps them, he sedates them, and he cuts their faces off to put on his daughter until he finds a face that actually is compatible with her skin. I know that the science in this movie is probably really off and really iffy, But I think that's besides the point, because every person that his face that he puts on his daughter ends up either melting or deforming or doing something weird where it won't last very long. So he keeps going over and over trying to replace different faces for his daughter. And it has one of the best makeup effect scenes in history, and I'm sure the black and white helps because it makes it more stark, and they didn't have to worry so much about the coloring of the blood. There's one scene where they show in detail a surgical removal of a young woman's face. You see them go in very detail. You see them cut the face off. You see them peel it off. And it looks fucking real. And this is 1960, mind you.
Yeah.
To have a scene like that in 1960 to that this day looks horrifying and frightening is such a fucking achievement. In fact, I don't think this could have been done in the U.S. at the time. It was probably far too macabre and probably far too graphic. I mean, if you really think about... this came out the same year as Psycho. Yeah. Which was in the U.S. Now, the stabbing shower scene in Psycho is pretty mild compared to what we see here. And in fact, you don't see anything in the stabbing shower scene. This shows you everything. I could not imagine a U.S. censors letting that slip by at the time.
Yeah.
And it's just a beautiful movie. I don't know how to describe it. It has the kind of gothic romance, even though it's not a romantic film in the slightest, it has the gothic romantic feeling of a lot of old Universal monster movies. It feels somewhat like a fairy tale, but its storyline is so dark and so fucking twisted. And I love that it matches the perfect balance between a delicate fairy tale and a macabre story underlying it. And of course, it just has great cinematography, very unique film. For me, it stands the test of time, and it has a very cathartic, almost beautiful ending for the movie that is kind of at odds with everything that came before, but still feels natural to the storyline.
Yeah.
And it's one that I recommend. I feel like it doesn't get enough love as far as being a horror classic goes, but it's one of the best horror movies to come out around that era, the late 1950s, the early 60s. And for that reason, it is number 39 on my list. Eyes Without a Face, 1960, France.
Well, look, years and years later when John Woo did that type of thing in Face Off with John Travolta and Nicolas Cage.
Yes.
And it wasn't nearly as realistic looking as that French one.
And it was goofy almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was almost played more for laughs, or it was kind of funny. This one, it looks real. Yeah. It looks very convincing to this day. They did a fantastic job with the makeup effects on this.
Yeah, like a good 30 years before that.
Yep.
All right, so my number 39 is 1408, another Stephen King film from 2007. This one was directed by Mikael Harstrom. He went on to direct The Right, which is a good movie, but not as good as 1408. I thought he had a big future ahead of him. Hopefully he'll still make another movie like 1408. But it was written by Matt Greenberg, who also wrote Prophecy 2 and Halloween H2O. Blech. But I think it was given to writers Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski for a rewrite because they wrote Ed Wood and People vs. Larry Flint. But it's based on
films.
Yeah, it's based on a short story by Stephen King that almost wasn't written. He originally wrote it for a nonfiction book on writing that he was writing. He wrote it as an example of how to revise a first draft, and he ended up liking it so much he kind of fleshed it out into a full short story. But it stars John Cusack in almost a one-man show, and phenomenal, by the way. And the great Samuel L. Jackson, who plays one of the best ominous Warners ever in a movie.
I would say the best ominous Warner.
Yeah. The menace and atmosphere is off the charts in this movie. It has really genuine scares that the build-up is solid, and so are the scares themselves. It's John Cusack at his best, I personally think. It's psychological and deep. Besides being, it's emotional. Besides being supernatural and scary. The
humanity that Stephen King is known for, the deep emotional layers,
and the scares based on loss and depression and despair. And it goes through the 5 stages of grief, which I thought was fascinating because you don't know it watching it. You don't consciously
register that.
Yeah, you don't consciously register that it's going through this, but it goes in this order. It goes denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And you see this one character go through all this just through the course of basically a supernatural attack. Like It's these spirits in this room almost attacking his mind and using his own grief against him. And I like how Cusack talks about how hotel rooms are inherently creepy in this, and I think that's one of the main reasons why this is so effective, because you hear of abandoned hotels and haunted hotels all over the world. And it's understandable because
the history.
They are inherently creepy. You don't know how many people have slept in those beds.
You don't know what's happened in those rooms.
Yeah,
if the walls of these hotels could talk, can you imagine the stories they would tell of all the things that happened over the years?
You don't know what these people are going through when they stay here. It's almost like they leave a little piece of their souls there, and not to mention bed bugs, which
the worst part.
are pretty fucking scary. If they would have added bed bugs to this, it would have been the scariest movie ever. But I absolutely love it because I love anything haunted house. And when this came out, it seemed like a premise that I'd always wanted to see, because I'm this guy. I'm not quite as I'm more of a believer than this guy is. I'm more willing to believe, but I'm a skeptic at heart, and that's why I go around to all these haunted places, because I'm curious. I want something to happen, and that's what made me put myself more in his shoes in this. And it's when curiosity like that goes completely wrong and turns on you. And I thought it was a great illustration of that.
Really good movie. I actually read the short story that is based on it, 1408. It's in Stephen King's collection of short stories from 1999 called Everything's Eventual. What I find most interesting about the movie is that it's faithful to what the short story is, but manages not to feel like they took a short story and stretched it out thin. Yeah. I find that's often the case in films that are based on short stories. They're stretched to the breaking point to make them feature length.
Yeah.
This movie never feels like it's straining to fulfill its runtime. It feels a little bit more organic and a little bit more natural.
Which is amazing because it's almost all one character.
All one character, all one room. And the other major character besides obviously his wife, or was it his ex-wife?
Yeah.
Yes. The other major character is Samuel L. Jackson as the manager of the hotel.
Yeah.
Man, he is the best ominous warner, because that's the cliche, is have somebody, an older man, ominously warn you why not you shouldn't go here, or the death or the despair that awaits you.
Yeah.
But when you got Samuel L. Jackson doing it in the Samuel L. Jackson style and the Samuel L. Jackson voice, it adds so much more to that type of role, and it makes it seem even better.
Yeah.
So that's almost like an elevated ominous warning, man.
And I love how John Cusack plays off of that, because you're mesmerized by the story that Samuel L. Jackson is telling you. Mm-hmm. You're thoroughly creeped out. You think, holy shit, if I was there, I'd go running out the door. And then they go to John Cusack, oh, whatever. You know, this is all bullshit.
Good interplay between those two actors.
Yeah. So that's why 1408 is so high on my list at 39.
Well, my number 38 is, we're coming back around to a movie that you just had on your list a couple spots ago. My number 38 is Black Christmas. Why this is my number 38 is I think it is one of the greatest slasher films of all time. It's definitely one of the most mature of the slasher movies. And it has some of the best atmosphere this side of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Halloween. I love the POV camera angles because they serve two different purposes. The POV camera angles puts you inside of the killer's head. So it works for a very artistic purpose, and it makes all of the killing seem a little bit more voyeuristic, a little more creepy, because you're experiencing it from the person who's carrying out these murders. At the same time, it's economical storytelling too, because you allows the Bob Clark to never show who the killer is by every time you think you're about to see him, the camera angle switches to his perspective, and instead you see the killing that he's about to carry out instead of seeing him. Really effective stuff. And I like that the movie is mysterious at the end of it all. It ends on a note where you think that everything has been solved on the surface, but then it ends where it just leaves you questioning, like, wait, what happened? What was going on? Is that the killer? It leaves your head spinning from all of it. Has really solid acting in here. John Saxon, of course, is a sheriff, playing another sheriff before he went on to play the sheriff in A Nightmare on Elm Street, Nancy's dad. What is it about these parts for him in horror movies?
I know.
He's really good in it. Margot Kidder, who of course is my favorite part of the movie. Olivia Hansey is really, really good in it. Dulea from 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Oh yeah.
Who plays the angry boyfriend who wants his girlfriend to get an abortion. And that's another interesting thing about this. This does not have the typical tropes that you'd expect from a slasher movie. Most of the slasher movies play by the rules that are very very strange when you think about it. If you have sex, you get killed. If you do drugs, you get killed. None of these women are punished for having sex in the movie. In fact, the final girl is actually pregnant, and there's a whole subplot about her right to choose to have an abortion because she wants to go with her career, and how her boyfriend, Dulea, takes it out in a very destructive, angry way and starts calling her a bitch, gets angry and tries to talk her out of it. It leaves you thinking that he might be the killer.
Yeah.
He acts so creepy and so strange. And he already had that strange quality of in 2001: A Space Odyssey. He has this really strange, cerebral delivery, that acting style that seems like it could be hiding some kind of sociopathy behind the facade.
Yeah.
So really little interesting commentary put into there, a little bit more mature, and like I said, it doesn't play by the sex and drugs rule of most slasher movies, and it doesn't force perfect virginity upon the final girl in this one, and that kind of sets it apart from other slasher movies.
And let's face it, a lot of slashers after that, the character interaction was a lot of mundane shit, like just the characters going through their everyday lives and just kind of filler until the kills got there. But this one had substance in the narrative, you know?
Yep, substance in the narrative, solid actresses, and none of them seem like frivolous teenagers or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's still effective to this day, and like I said, we actually got to see this last year for Michael's birthday on the big screen, and having the opportunity to see Black Christmas on the big screen was an opportunity to discover just how fucking good this movie actually is. I've always been a fan of it, but seeing it in that context just fucking heightened the experience for me. And for that reason, Black Christmas is my number 38 film.
Cool. My number 38 film is a batshit crazy one from 1985, The Reanimator.
Oh, that's an awesome movie.
Directed and co-written by the great Stuart Gordon, who did From Beyond, Dolls, Pit and the Pendulum, Castle Freak, Dagon. This guy was just awesome in the 80s. It's based on a story by H.P. Lovecraft, and it's written by Dennis Paoli. And it stars the great Jeffrey Combs in one of his best roles, if not his best. And the beautiful, gorgeous Scream Queen Barbara Crampton is one of the greatest treasures of horror, as far as I'm concerned. And David Gale is Dr. Carl Hill. And I got to give respect to this guy. He lost his wife in the course of making this film, because that part where he's holding his own head and he pushes his head into Barbara Crampton's crotch.
Head giving head.
Yeah. The moment his wife seen that, she divorced him, and they never...
Didn't she run out of the screening and say, "How could you?
Yeah, how could you, David? How could you, David?"
It's a fucking movie.
But the gore is amazing in this. The comedy, the imagination of it, the bubbling energy and the wild nature of it throughout. And like I said, Jeffrey Combs at his best, and Barbara Crampton at her sweetest and most vulnerable and beautiful. And they got together a couple more times in Stuart Gordon movies after this, but I think this was the best pairing, even though Castle Freak was awesome.
I love the spirit of this movie.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's really gory, and its gore is so over the top and so zany. It's not scary at all. I don't find it remotely scary or horrifying. Instead, it takes horror elements or horror imagery and iconography and pumps them up to such absurd levels that you end up giddy from watching it. The experience is more like coming off a high, because it's hard not to laugh at some of the inventive bits of wackiness that they come up with the gore. The way that their intestines start attacking, all the headless bodies, the ridiculous dialogue on top of it, to be such absurd, cheesy, campy dialogue, but it feels intentionally campy, to be having going on in the midst of this batshit insanity just spreading throughout the movie. Absolute fucking blast. It's one of those horror movies that for me is pure fun, a pure hit of bliss.
But I love how it slowly goes insane, but it's always entertaining. It starts out very serious and very dramatic.
But once it hits the mark where it starts going off, it's insane. It never stops going off the rails in the best way possible.
You first see hints in Jeffrey Combs' performance. That's when you first get hints of how crazy this movie's going to go. And then once he starts getting really into his experiments, things go batshit crazy, and they just get crazier and crazier from there. And it all seems, it never seems like it shifts tones. It always seems like the same movie, mostly because Jeffrey Combs is so sincere as Herbert West.
It's kind of a campy performance, but a believable campy performance. Like, you believe him within the context of this universe and the story.
Yeah.
That he is genuine.
And I was invested in the, like the story between the scientists, and it's kind of the combative between them, and then this student gets involved, and then Jeffrey Combs comes into the mix, and he's kind of resented by the older doctor, Carl Hill. So it's a really cool dynamic between all the characters, and then it goes completely insane, but it never seems out of place. It always seems very much a part of the narrative, like how Stuart Gordon meant it to be from the beginning.
That's an excellent movie. It didn't make my top 50, but it is a film that I like a lot. I like it a lot.
Yeah, and this was actually turned into a musical. I got to see a performance of one of the scenes, and there was blood everywhere and singing and just reckless abandon, just like the movie. So I would love to see that whole musical. But I could see this one turning into a perfect musical here because of the energy of it. So that's why Reanimator is my number 38.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll make a jack-o'-lantern out of your best friend's head.
Coming in at number 37 on my list is what I consider to be a modern horror classic, and it is very much a classic and will be regarded as one years down the line, is Jordan Peele's brilliant debut film, Get Out. As far as I'm concerned, Get Out is the Night of the Living Dead of the modern era. Peele instantly established himself as a distinct horror auteur while releasing one of the most timely, original, and poignant horror movies of the modern era. It tapped into the cultural zeitgeist the way that few films could ever hope to do. It's definitely one of the highlights of this decade in horror movies, and it's a turning point for the genre too. I feel like Jordan Peele brought respectability back to the horror genre, even though I feel like the horror genre has always been respectable and there's always been great films that have come out of it. It's the first horror movie since The Silence of the Lambs, which is even debatable if that is a horror movie.
Yeah.
To get nominated for so many awards, for Best Picture, for Best Director, to win Best Screenplay, for Best Actor. And in my view, it was all deserved, and it deserved all the acclaim and the praise that it got. Now, I know a lot of it's controversial because some people don't consider this horror. It is very much horror. I see people say it's a suspense thriller, and even Jordan Peele himself is a little insulted by that label. He says it hurts his feelings when people tell him that Get Out is not a horror movie. Because if you look at it from the perspective of the main character, it's pretty horrifying.
Oh yeah.
And I think a lot of horror fans get irritated by this movie because it is political and it does deal with race relations in America very heavily. But it's never done in a way that's preachy, and it's not shoehorned in. And let's face it, political and social commentary has been a very integral part of the horror genre from its very inception. It's always used as a device. Horror is always used as a device of storytelling to substitute for something in real life. There's a lot of social commentary in there. I mean, just think about Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah.
Total parable of the late 1960s, and it sums up that era so perfectly well. This film to me does what Night of the Living Dead did in the 1960s. It took a snapshot of America and how it is, its race relations, how we deal with it, and basically preserved it for future generations to observe it. And man, this movie would not have been such a big hit if it didn't tap into something. And it's also genuinely scary in my view. Every time I watch it, I get caught up. I've seen it about 5 times now, and every time I watch it, I feel like I'm peeling back more layers. The story's very deceptively simple on the surface. It seems a little simple, but the more you dive into it, there's a lot going on underneath.
Yeah.
The horror is very slow building, and it's not overtly a horror movie for a long time. It just gives little hints of strangeness and weirdness and little bits that come off here and there. Catherine Keener is awesome as one of the main villains as the hypnotist.
Yeah,
and it has some of the coolest, strangest imagery to ever be seen in a mainstream release, a mainstream horror film. When you think about the sunken place, or you think about the room that Daniel Kaluuya is locked up in at towards the end when he's trapped, the TV that's playing, it seems like it takes place almost outside of time. There's certain scenes that have such a strange, surreal quality to them, but everything on the surface seems normal. It's psychologically disturbing, it's well acted, it's classy, it's original, it's simple enough that you could appreciate it on a surface level, with enough layers that you could go in and really delve into the movie and dissect it and break it apart. And there's a lot of I don't have time to go into all of them, but there's a lot of Easter eggs in this movie, a lot of little hints of what's going on here and there. It's so much detail that Jordan Peele put into it. And man, what a fucking debut. Yeah. He came out right off the bat. And what I like about Jordan Peele is that he always wanted to make horror movies. And you could see it on the comedy Key and Peele. There's a lot of episodes of Key and Peele that are outright parodies of horror movies, or they have characters discussing movies or horror movies. So you could tell that this is made by a filmmaker who was hungry to go out and establish himself right away. And he did so in such a distinctive, memorable way. He made one of the standout films of the 2010s, one of the most culturally significant films to come out in the 2010s. And just for me, one of the best horror movies of the past 10 years. I love this movie. Get Out rightly established Jordan Peele as a new somebody to look out for in the horror genre.
And another great performance from Bradley Whitford.
Oh, yeah, after Cabin in the Woods.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that movie because it not only holds up in repeat viewings, it makes you want to watch it again and again in a short amount of time.
You saw it like within a handful of times within the span of a month, didn't you?
Yeah. Because I would just feel like watching it again, and then when somebody else would come over, I'd feel like watching it with them. All right, so my number 37 is another one from one of my favorite subgenres, werewolves. It doesn't have nearly enough good movies, but one of the best is Neil Marshall's Dog Soldiers from 2002. Mm-hmm. Written and directed by Neil Marshall, who went on to do The Descent. This was his first feature film. I don't know what happened to you lately, Neil Marshall, but I hope you get back to movies like this. It's about a military exercise in Scotland that is interrupted by werewolves. It's an ensemble cast of military types led by like Sean Pertwee, Kevin McKidd, Liam Cunningham, and a great performance from Emma Cleesby as Megan, who brings a good female flavor into this group of testosterone-laden men. But I love the military camaraderie and fighting aspect of it, because I'm always interested to see how military types handle like monsters and ghouls, you know, because they have this they've seen horror before. They go into the military knowing that they might see real life horror, so it's interesting to see how they handle stuff like this. And the main thing that's great about this movie, besides the ensemble cast, is the scary, menacing werewolves. They were huge. They were well designed. It was these big animal men, wolf men, standing upright and just hunching over these guys. And not only did they look menacing and scary, they moved menacing and scary. Neil Jordan knew to put actors in these
Neil
suits.
Marshall. Neil Jordan is the director of The Crying Game and Interview with the Vampire.
But Neil Marshall knew that you don't just take extras and throw them in a werewolf costume. Mm-hmm. You get people who can move properly and who can act animalistic, and then you're going to get scary werewolves.
These are the most, as far as werewolves go, the depiction of werewolves, there's two ways that they're typically depicted. One is really silly. You see what is obviously a man in a wolf mask running around, and it's slightly hunched and it's always goofy. Then you see a better version, which is when they just you see them transform into a straight werewolf, and you see it in a movie like The Howling with that awesome transformation scene. This, for me, has the most believable versions of a werewolf ever put on the screen. Yeah. Because the idea of a werewolf is that it's a human-animal hybrid. And this one, the werewolves in this actually look like hybrids. They don't look like a human in a suit, and they don't look like a straight wolf. Yeah. They're hunched over, and they have features of features of human beings. The way that they kind of move a little bit, but they actually incorporate the moves, the look, and the hunchness of a wolf. Yeah. So it feels like a genuine hybrid between a human and a wolf. Yeah. And I'm surprised that in the history of movies about werewolves, I'd never seen one that depicted them in a way that I would think is a little bit more realistic.
Yeah. And I love the way it's mostly set in this one location. Like all the soldiers end up. The fight starts in the woods, and then they kind of hole up in this house, and then the werewolves start coming at them from all around. So it's almost like a Night of the Living Dead type of thing, except it's monsters. Just besides it being a great werewolf film, overall it's a great fight to the death. It shows these guys where you get just enough interaction between this ensemble cast where you kind of get an idea of what their personalities are like, and then to see the way each one of those personalities reacts to this attack. And some of them become selfish, some of them sacrifice themselves for the others. So it's a really compelling, entertaining action horror film with a lot of action, a lot of drama, a lot of everything that I love about these types of movies, and overall great fucking werewolves. And if you want to see an example of why these werewolves are so great, watch Late Phases. Late Phases came out in the last few years. I think it's Nick D'Amici stars in it. His excellent performance as an old man who goes up against these werewolves. It's dramatic, it's got a good story, it's well written, and then these fucking werewolves come on the screen and they look like giant rats. And the way they move isn't menacing, and it kind of screws up the whole dynamic of the movie. So those werewolves compared to the werewolves of Dog Soldiers, you really see a difference in how to make a scary ass fucking werewolf that's not just a big giant wolf, it's half man, half wolf. And that's why Neil Marshall's Dog Soldiers is 2002. Maybe if Neil Marshall would make some more good movies, I'd start remembering.
Wait, you said it's 2002?
Yeah.
So my number 36 movie is, I actually wrestled with putting this movie on because I've only seen it once and it's brand new and it came out in the past month. I've only seen it a month ago. Is Robert Eggers' latest masterpiece, The Lighthouse. Now, I may or may not regret putting this on my list in the future, but I seriously doubt I will. If anything, it's probably going to go up. The reason that it's on here right away is because few films grab me the way that one did upon the first viewing. I felt from the opening frames all the way to the very end, I was witnessing a modern masterpiece unfold right before my very eyes. I feel that The Witch, which is his debut film, is probably a little bit better as a horror movie, but this is still a damn fine horror movie. And as, in my opinion, and this is just based on one viewing, I had always considered John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness to be the gold standard for surreal horror movies that plunge you inside a dip into insanity. This, I feel, tops that and takes it to new levels. The performances by Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe are absolutely fucking towering. I feel like Willem Dafoe has the more showy role between him and Robert Pattinson, but Robert Pattinson really rises to the occasion when he's called upon to do so.
Yeah.
It has such a strange, ethereal quality to it that I can't describe. I love that it was filmed with lenses from 1918 and 1933, as you told me on one of our podcasts, which I was not aware of before. It really helps to take you back to the time when the movie is supposed to take place. It's never specified, but it seems like it's taking place in the 1890s, I believe. And it feels like a movie that could have fell through space and time and just landed in 2019. It has a timeless quality where I feel this movie would have been great in the 1960s, in the 1980s, the 70s, the 90s. It would have been great in the 40s, 30s. I don't picture it ever aging just because its style is so timeless and so out of touch with anything modern. And it has some of the eeriest scenes I've seen in a Descent into Madness movie.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the imagery of mermaids and some stuff that's indescribable, tentacles and strange images. Like, it's hard for me to describe, to actually put into words, but it's kind of enveloping in the way that reminds me a little bit of The Shining.
Yeah.
Where you feel like you're put squarely into a descent into madness, and it does it really, really well. I don't want to talk about this too much because we've actually spoken about this on the podcast twice recently.
Yeah.
Because it's a brand new film. It might be early. It might be a little bit early, but right now I'm putting The Lighthouse at number 36, and I doubt that I'm gonna regret putting it at the spot either.
Yeah, I wanted to put it in mine so bad, I just wouldn't let myself because I've only watched it once. I know it's gonna be probably in my top 25 once all is said and done, and I watch it a few more times. All right, my number 36 is one of my personal favorites from 2008. Pontypool. It's a Canadian film directed by Bruce McDonald. He went on to direct Hellions in 2015. I need to watch that because besides that, he has only done a bunch of TV. I don't know why this man has not done more movies because this is an excellent, excellent movie. Written by Tony Burgess, who also wrote the novel. It's about a radio host, Grant Mazzy, played by Stephen McHattie, who is broadcasting over the radio on his night shift when a virus starts infecting the town, and it spreads through words, through the English language. Now, I'm going to make a bold statement and say this is the most original zombie movie after George Romero. George Romero revolutionized the zombie folklore like nobody ever has, and I think this is the most original this kind of folklore has ever been handled after George Romero. It's just it's spreading through words and also being told through in this one location in this radio station. So you hear them kind of talk to listeners that are out in the town who are in the middle of this apocalypse. They don't believe that it's this kind of outbreak at first. It's a slow realization that they have, and it's very much of a slow burn. The character piece of both Grant Mazzy and Lisa Howell, who plays Sidney Breyer. And when you watch this movie, the phrase Sidney Breyer is alive will give you chills after watching this. It almost never feels like a zombie movie. And the onset of the disease is frightening. One of my personal fears is to have some kind of dementia or lose my mind somehow where I don't know what I'm saying. I don't know if you've ever seen a loved one talk out of their head like that. It's a scary experience. And I think that is brilliantly illustrated in this movie, where you're in the middle of talking to someone and they're in a regular conversation back and forth, and there's an ingenious way that they have to limit their words talking to each other because they don't know which words in the English language are infected. And once you say that word, your mind kind of focuses on it.
Almost kind of supernatural, like a spell.
Yeah. So you say that word.
Hypnosis zombies.
Yeah, and you start repeating that word, and then you try to say another sentence, and then that word jumps into your sentence again, and then you slowly become more and more coherent until you go completely crazy and like the zombies in 28 Days Later and just want to rip everything apart.
It's definitely one of the most original takes on a zombie I've ever seen in a movie. Because if you think about it, what other zombie movie does it like as an incantation or as a spell? The only ones that I could think of that are similar to that are the old zombies that are not really, they don't feast on brains, they don't eat people, the voodoo zombies, the supernatural ones.
Yeah.
This seems to combine elements of a supernatural zombie with George Romero's more vicious man-eating zombie and puts them together. But the way that it's called forth is pretty original.
Yeah.
I wish I had more crosstalk on this movie because I did see this movie with Michael. I was drunk, however. So
another one like Plague Town.
Yeah. There's a good period of time where I was drinking a lot while watching movies, but I don't do that anymore.
Well, this and Plague Town are two of those movies where everybody that comes over, they have to watch it with me. And then it just so happens that half the time that I do that, we end up getting drunk and high before we watch it.
Being high before a movie I can handle. Being high on a podcast I can handle. Being drunk is a whole other experience that makes it hard to recall anything or to get anything clear in my head. Yeah. So unfortunately I don't have more to say about this movie despite seeing it one time. Number 35 for me is Clive Barker's masterpiece Hellraiser from 1987. A couple of reasons why this is on my list. One, aside from Clive Barker being the director of Hellraiser, he is actually my favorite horror writer of all time, as I've spoken about on this podcast before. I absolutely adore that man's imagination and his brain, the imagery that he conjures up. And this is a perfect visual representation of the type of imagery that you imagine when you're reading any one of his novels. It gave us a new horror icon in the form of Pinhead, and it gave us one of the most unique horror icons. With Freddy or with Michael Myers or with Jason, their whole thing is that they're just murderers and they're trying to kill you and hunt you down. Pinhead is a sadist, and that's where the S&M angle comes into this, and I really like that aspect being thrown so much into the narrative because it's such a big part of Clive Barker's writing. The connections between pleasure and pain, sex and death, and how they're somewhat interlinked. Pinhead just wants to torture you and wants to endlessly torture you for eternity. So that's even worse than having somebody who wants to kill you. But what makes it even creepier is that in his brain, what he's doing is affection. It's love. And I love how the design of each Cenobite, how they each incorporate different elements of S&M into their design, where that pinhead is just filled with pins. Some people's looks like their face is being torn off. There's like different devices running through the heads. Like I said, this is really hard imagery for me to describe, and I wouldn't even know how to put it into words, but Clive Barker does such a damn good job of doing it. And what's more impressive is how visual this movie is. A lot of times when authors try to make a movie based on their own work, they're very precious about it, and they try to remain faithful to the literary adaptation, and it usually ends up making anemic live-action movies. Clive Barker actually changed a lot of this from the novel it's based on. It's based on a novella called The Hellbound Heart, and he actually changes the relationships of certain characters. He changes the physical attributes of certain characters. He modifies everything so it could fit for a film, where he was able to recognize that Hellraiser as a film has to function differently than The Hellbound Heart functions as a piece of literature. And it just has some of the most striking imagery in any of the horror movies I've seen. The gore makeup is really good. It's really inventive. And it has one of my favorite scenes in horror is when Frank is slowly being reconstructed as the blood keeps pouring and you see his body reforming itself and becoming something new. So imaginative and so well pulled off with all the gore makeup. Of course, Pinhead is an icon for the ages. It's just such a trippy, strange experience, and there's nothing else in a horror quite like Hellraiser. Definitely one of the most unique movies to come out of the 1980s, and a perfect visual representation of one of the finest minds to have ever touched the horror genre.
Yeah, and it's one of those villains that when Pinhead walks in the room, somebody's going to lose their soul. Somebody's going to die. It's very threatening. And
it has, I think, some of the most fascinating lore behind any horror movie villain or any horror movie universe, because Clive Barker's horror is not as simple as a boogeyman coming out to get you. There's a lot more going on underneath it, and there's always a lot of sexuality in Clive Barker's works, and I love that he juxtaposes eroticism with torture and violence, and it only serves to make the movie creepier because subconsciously as you're watching it, you're starting to draw these distinctions in your head or the similarities between pleasure and pain, and how depending on your perspective, one is not so different from the other. So overall, totally unique in the horror genre. Nothing else exists like Hellraiser, and that is why it is number 35 on my list.
I love Hellraiser. And yet another coincidence, my 35 is another horror icon created by Clive Barker, Candyman, in 1992. Candyman. Directed and written by the great Bernard Rose, who done an excellent job here with a story, The Forbidden, based on the story by Clive Barker. It's about a grad student who studies the Candyman urban legend and suddenly summons him. Of course, the standouts in this are Tony Todd, the great Tony Todd as Candyman, and Virginia Madsen. It's gothic, it's moody and creepy with an instantly iconic horror villain in Tony Todd. It maintains its creepiness all the way to the end, and the story is very well told and dramatic. And it's one of those it could have fallen flat because it was so serious, but it ended up being just a masterpiece to me. I never get tired of it. It's a great telling of an urban legend, and I think
it has the best takes on urban legends I've ever seen in a horror movie.
Yeah, and I think it actually became more popular than the urban legend.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the urban legend had to do a lot with like Bloody Mary and stuff like that, but
Candyman.
This movie made people scared to say. People are still scared to say Candyman 5 times in the mirror.
This is another unusual element I wanted to draw attention to. I believe it was Philip Glass who did the score for it.
Yeah.
Is this not one of the most magnificent scores you've ever heard in a horror film?
Yes.
It's like gothic, it's creepy, it's old school, but it feels very modern at the same time.
And that's what makes it feel very romantic.
Tony Todd is a big part of what makes this movie great. And what's interesting is that you don't really see Tony Todd appear as Candyman until, I'd say, I've counted it before, I don't remember exactly, but I think it's a little past the 40-minute mark of the movie before he actually appears. And he doesn't litter the movie like the most of the movie doesn't even feature Tony Todd scenes with Tony Todd.
Yeah.
But once he's there, his presence looms over the entire film.
Yeah, you always
he has
feel him there,
such
yeah.
a presence or a quality that reminds me a little bit of Bela Lugosi, some of the old movie monsters where he feels a little bit more classy, more dignified, and there's something very romantic and almost kind of cool to look at. He looks cool, the way that he's dressed, his style, but he's frightening in a way that feels believable because he's seductive, the way that he speaks really slow and the way that he slowly seduces you. He's kind of mesmerizing to behold. His voice, his vocal inflections. And Tony Todd is actually a classically trained stage actor.
Yeah.
And I could totally see it. I could see Tony Todd pulling off Shakespearean roles because of his role in Candyman.
And he's just as mesmerizing to the viewer as he is his victims.
Yes.
You feel yourself falling under the same spell as his victims are.
Yeah.
So
He's
you kind of
fucking magnificent voice for that role too.
Yeah. Like I remember watching it and thinking, how could I be so accepting of Virginia Madsen giving in to his charm and his spell?
Because he seduces the audience while he's seducing his victims at the same time.
Yeah. So that's why Candyman is my number 35.
My number 35 is an older one. It is The Night of the Hunter from 1955. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so this one was directed by the actor Charles Laughton. When this movie came out, it had very poor reviews. People said it was too cerebral, artsy in a way that was annoying. And it wasn't just overall, it wasn't a success. And it's the only film that Charles Laughton ever directed. He mostly did acting. And it's a fucking damn shame because it would have been if it had more appreciation in its time, it would have I'm pretty sure it would have kicked off a career of masterpieces. Robert Mitchum plays Reverend Harry Powell, and he's one of the greatest horror movie villains in history, in my view. He's basically just a thug, who is trying to insinuate himself into the life of a single mom and her 2 kids because he was a cellmate with her husband, with the father of these children, and he told them that there was money hidden in the house. So he's very charming the way that he insinuates himself into the family. Everybody likes him. The mother is taken aback by him. He seems very righteous and religious, and of course he has those things on his knuckles, the love-hate tattoos that are imprinted on his knuckles, and he gives a speech about love and hate and how life is a struggle and a battle between those 2 emotions, which Spike Lee actually played tribute to in Do the Right Thing when he had Radio Raheem, not tattoos, but on his knuckles, those ring knuckles that he had that said love and hate, and he gives the exact same speech in there. What makes it such a great horror movie is that it's the best horror movie that's made from the perspective of children, because he terrifies the kids in this movie, and it uses a lot of German expressionism and a lot of very artistic camera angles and excellent use of shadow, that when he's chasing after the children, it seems almost exaggerated in how impressionistic it is, and how his shadow looms is a little bit ridiculous. But what makes it work is that you're seeing it through the eyes of children, of small people whose minds are not completely shaped yet, that somebody who's coming after you like this would be lurking like a Frankenstein monster, even though that's not what he is.
Yeah.
So he has that ability to be very charming at the same time and frightening to kids. And man, this movie has some of the most beautiful images ever in a horror movie. Some of the imagery is horrifying, but beautiful at the same time. One of the best examples is Shelley Winters, who's in this movie. There's a part where she is underwater, or she's dead, and the way that the camera and I don't know how they pulled this off because there couldn't have been any special effects. She's just she's just tied up in a car underwater, and you see the camera just sitting there floating as her hair is flowing back in the water and holding it. And the camera just holds onto that angle for a very long time, which makes me wonder how long Shelley Winters had to be underwater tied up in a car. But it is one of the strangest and most beautiful images I've ever seen in a horror movie. It's awful, of course, but it's so artful in the way that it's directed. It's just a gorgeous movie to look at. Robert Mitchum is fucking absolutely aces in the lead role. It's beautifully directed, and for my money, the best horror movie about horror from the perspective of children, because it makes you see horror as a child would see it, not as an adult would see it.
Yeah.
And for that reason, it is number 34 on my list, The Night of the Hunter from 1955. An underrated, another one of those movies that was underrated in its time. It never got its due, but I'm glad to know that now it is considered a classic film and one of the greatest movies to come from the 1950s.
I never rewatched that one because I know I've seen it, but I don't remember any of it. Everything you said right now sounded new.
Yeah, definitely worth a rewatch.
Well, my 34 is another of one of my favorite subgenres, werewolf film, Ginger Snaps, my personal favorite werewolf film from 2000. And I probably watched this movie more than most of the movies on my list. I love everything about this movie. I love all the characters. I love the werewolf. The sound design is awesome. It's directed by John Fawcett, and he co-wrote it with Karen Walton. It stars Emily Perkins as Bridget. She's my favorite part of the movie. Catherine Isabel, who went on to do American Mary with the Soska sisters, she plays Ginger, the one that turns into a werewolf. And then Chris Lemke, I love him in this as Sam, the drug dealer, because there's something about this guy, just the way he looks and the way he carries himself. I just hang on his every word for some reason. And then Mimi Rogers in a great supporting role as the mom, and Jesse Moss as Jason the creep that gets turned into a werewolf by Ginger. Anyway, like I said, the werewolf design is cool. It's not as cool compared to the rest of the film. The rest of the film, I think, is a horror masterpiece. So when the werewolf comes, it's one of those, it's a full-bodied werewolf. And this one's pretty much hairless, and it looks kind of weird, but it still is very effective.
It's more ugly because it's hairless, though.
Yeah, exactly. It's the sound design that sold. Any shortcomings on the werewolf design is fixed for me in the sound design. It sounds and feels like that werewolf is in the room with you when that thing is growling. The kills that are off screen are just as effective as the ones on screen because of the sound design. It has great effects, great werewolf attacks. And then the werewolf attacks that don't show the werewolf are actually scarier than the ones when they do. But it's buoyed by the whole movie is buoyed by the performance of these two girls who play sisters. They feel like sisters. You feel the emotion between them. You feel the pain of the disconnect when Ginger starts turning into a werewolf and her sister's trying to stop it. You feel that disconnect, and you feel how much it must hurt, especially for Emily Perkins as Bridget, to see this happening to her sister. So she's desperately trying to stop it. It's an original story. The characters are genuine. Like I said, the girls felt like sisters, and it had an emotional layer that adds to the drama and adds to the horror and makes everything more fulfilling and more satisfying. The werewolf attacks are gory. You feel them emotionally and viscerally. The way it sets up the horror in this is that the sisters are very morbid and they're obsessed with death. And they have fantasies about killing themselves. So these aren't innocent young girls. I was emotionally invested in every bit of it, and it makes the horror that much scarier. And I just love the performance from these girls. I love the performance from all the supporting cast. It's a great Canadian film from 2000, Ginger Snaps, and it's my number 34.
You certainly really like the werewolf movies.
Yes.
I don't have any on my list.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Number 33 for me is Lost Highway by David Lynch from 1997. I can't put this movie into words, so here's a few words to describe the experience of watching Lost Highway. Haunting, beautiful, mysterious, scary, funny, surreal, nightmarish. This is amongst the most unique films to ever hit the horror genre, and I know this is another one that people debate. I don't debate its status as a horror movie. For me, it's unquestionably a horror movie, but I don't think it was designed as a horror movie. David Lynch's imagination is just naturally horrifying. It's one of those movies that pulls you along and makes you feel like you are actually caught up in a nightmare in it. The perfect example of nightmare fuel is one particular scene that involves Robert Blake. He plays the personification of evil in this movie, a man with no eyebrows. Bill Pullman and Patricia Arquette are in this movie, as well as Balthazar Getty. There's a scene where Bill Pullman is at a party in LA, and it just looks like a regular party. It looks kind of like Hollywood types are there. And then you see Robert Blake hanging out in the distance, and Bill Pullman notices, and Robert Blake is pale white. He has no fucking eyebrows on whatsoever. And when he zeroes in on him, all the music that's playing just dies out and it goes silent as Robert Blake walks up to Bill Pullman, and then he starts talking to him and saying these really strange things, tells him to call up his house. And when he calls up his house, Robert Blake is there on the other line, laughing. He tells him that you've invited me into your house, you've let me into your life, and he is supposed to be the personification of evil. And the fucking laugh that he does sends shivers down my spine every time I hear it. It makes my blood run cold. When you hear Robert Blake laughing in Bill Pullman's face while Bill Pullman is holding a phone, and you hear Robert Blake on the phone laughing him at the same time, it feels like you are seeing something genuinely evil unfolding before your eyes. It gives me chills. There's another scene where Robert Blake is approaching Bill Pullman again, and he pulls a camera, and he's just walking towards him, and Bill Pullman is running away, and the camera keeps switching between Robert Blake's character, Mystery Man, filming him, and Bill Pullman running away. And as it gets closer and closer and closer, and Bill Pullman gets in his car and he's trying to drive off, you feel yourself palpably getting like very nervous and anxious while you're watching it. It has some of the purest imagery I've ever seen in a horror movie. These images are pulled deeply from the subconscious mind and put at the forefront, and that's what's fascinating about it, and I think why it works so well as a horror movie, because the imagery is so strange that it could only exist in the imagination. It's so inexplicable, and it's the type of imagery you'd think you'd never see in your life. And I think that's what David Lynch is a master at, using cinematic language to convey the actual experience of what a nightmare scenario is like. This is one of Patricia Arquette's best movies. I love her in this, and she plays a dual role in it, and she's good in both roles. Bill Pullman is good, and of course you got Balthazar Getty. And the story doesn't always make complete sense, but I don't think it's supposed to. Although I do have my own interpretation, and I think I know what's going on. It is just a perfectly realized nightmare that just plunges the audience into a world that they never thought they'd experience. And it's something that only David Lynch could ever achieve. Nobody can make a film like David Lynch. Nobody can really access the deep parts of your subconscious the way that David Lynch does. And David Lynch is one of the most revered living filmmakers. He's considered one of the greatest artists to ever hit the medium, and yet this is still an underrated movie in his career. It's every bit as good as some of his finest work, and it's up there with some of his best work, and I don't think it gets the due credit that it deserves.
And I thought Bob from Twin Peaks was one of the scariest characters I've ever seen, but I think Robert Blake might be even scarier in Lost Highway. And that's saying a lot, because fucking Bob is scary as hell.
Pure nightmare fuel and endlessly rewatchable, and for that reason, Lost Highway is number 33 on my list. 1997, David Lynch.
Yes, I love Lost Highway.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show Podcast.
And my number 33, I go from werewolves to vampires. 30 Days of Night from 2007, directed by David Slade, and it was written by Steve Niles, who wrote the comic, Stuart Beattie, who wrote Collateral with Tom Cruise, and Brian Nelson, who wrote Hard Candy and Devil. It's about a vicious gang of vampires who attack an Alaskan town where the sun sets for 30 days. Josh Hartnett really shines here in one of his best performances, and unsung scream queen Melissa George. I love her, even though she did the Amityville Horror remake. She was good in it, but the movie was bad. But the biggest standout here is Danny Houston as the head vampire. He's scary, he's menacing. The vampires are nasty, they're brutal. Another one where when the villain is in the room, somebody's going to die. And it's that constant threat throughout. I've noticed that a lot of these movies that set up villains that are a major threat, like they kind of have to take the threat down a little bit in order for them to have a formidable fight with the protagonist. But with this one, they stayed scary and threatening throughout. Whenever they showed up, you thought somebody was going to die. The vampires are animalistic, they're scary, and they have their own language that they created for the movie, which is scary as hell to hear them talk. And then when they use games like having an innocent girl kind of walk through the street and yell for help, and some people want to go out and help her, but then they realize that they just put her out there as bait. And then when they kill this girl, they don't just kill her. They have this disdain for humanity. that really comes through in the narrative. Like they hate humans just for being human, for being weak. And they taunt them for that. And they tell that poor young girl that there's no God right before she dies. And she, oh, God, help me. And he just looks at her, no God. That's still scary as hell. On top of having great, really scary vampires, it has a very distinctive atmosphere among all the violence. And then some of the wide shots of the vampires going through the town and killing people and dragging them through the snow. And you see these big tracks of blood going through the snow, and you see just chaos going around and fires popping everywhere. It feels very chaotic and scary. It feels like somebody should have come up with this premise already. When these parts in Alaska are plunged into darkness for 30 days or sometimes 60 days.
It's a perfect setting for a horror movie.
And it's just a feeding frenzy with these vampires, especially them being so vicious. And then it has one of the best decapitations in movie history. It might be the best for me. Because not only is it great effects, you feel the emotion of it because it's Josh Hartnett is killing his friend who's becoming a vampire. And on top of it being one of his best friends, you see this guy, you know how we talked about before, how different people handle situations like this differently? Well, this guy went the other way. He went completely weak. He killed his whole family to keep them from being eaten by vampires. He was just a weak individual. It turned out to be just a sad sack piece of shit. You feel that disappointment from Josh Hartnett. You feel that deep disappointment he has in this guy over what he did to his family. And then on top of that, he has to chop his head off. And he hits it once, and it kind of causes this big gash in his neck. He hits him again, and his head kind of flops to the side, but his neck is still hanging on. And that one final blow that takes the head all the way off, and you see every hit, and then you see the head fall. One of the best decapitations in history. And the only reason why this would probably be in my top 10 if it wasn't for the end being slightly hokey. Not enough to kill the movie, but in comparison to how great and visceral and entertaining and dramatic the rest of it was, the end of it came off as a little hokey and a little comic bookish because it was based on a comic book. So it would be higher on my list if it wasn't for that, but still, this is one of the greatest vampire films ever made with some of the scariest vampires ever on screen, and that's why it's number 33, 30 Days of Night.
Well, your number 33 is a vampire film. My number 32 is the original vampire film. Nosferatu from 1922, directed by F.W. Murnau. Now, the reason that this movie is on my list is that it's a timeless antique. While I do feel that a lot of people are going to be underwhelmed when they see Nosferatu because they're not going to be able to adjust to the time that it came out, the thing that really makes this movie work for me is Max Schreck as Count Orlok, which is just a variation on Dracula. It is probably the scariest, creepiest looking vampire ever put to film. And this is 1922, mind you.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like you're watching an acting performance. It feels like there's actually a vampire in the film. And that's what gives it such a haunted quality. The famed critic Roger Ebert once said of Nosferatu that watching the film is like standing in a room with death itself. And I'm inclined to agree with that statement. The imagery is just so unprecedented, especially when you consider it was 1922 when this was made. The image of Nosferatu rising when he's on the boat is just one of the coolest scenes I've ever seen in a horror movie to this day. There's something almost demonic about Max Schreck's portrayal of Count Orlok, which is basically Dracula. All the images and the way that it's edited. The scene where Jonathan Harker is in his room and Count Orlok keeps getting closer, and the way that it's edited, every time the edit comes up, he's closer and closer and closer and closer, and he feels like he's getting closer and closer to you. Don't you think this is the makeup that they put on him for 1922 is way ahead of its time?
Oh, yeah.
I feel like a lot of people struggle to capture the look of what Nosferatu was like, but they always manage to fail. Nobody ever gets it quite right or gets exactly at what makes Max Schreck's performance so great.
But a lot of it was his actual face. His face was very menacing looking, and the makeup kind of
accentuated it a little.
Accentuated what his face already looked like.
And there was a movie, what was it, Shadow of the Vampire?
Shadow of the Vampire,
because he's so effective as the vampire and so convincing that there's a whole lot of folklore, a lot of urban legends about how F.W. Murnau actually hired a real vampire for the screen, and I could definitely see how that came out, especially at the time. I could see how people would have interpreted it that way, because let's be honest, there probably was nothing as frightening looking on the screen before this film. So it's one of the original horror movies, the original vampire movie. It feels a little bit antiquated, but in the best way possible, because it feels like you're watching something that happened a long time ago. And also the setting of the movie is really what sells it. It's Max Schreck and the setting that he's in, the Carpathian Mountains. God, what a fucking beautiful place to film. The Count Orlok where he lives looks genuinely haunted, creepy. It doesn't look like a place you'd ever want to visit or be stuck in. Yeah. That's for sure. There's just something about it that feels so timeless and so beautiful. Definitely one of the most influential of all horror movies, one of the most important horror movies of all time, and one of the greatest vampire movies of all time. 1922's Nosferatu is a timeless classic and one of the key touchstones of the horror genre.
Yeah, that's the farthest you went back so far, huh?
Yeah, I think so.
My 32 doesn't go back too far. 1999, The Sixth Sense.
A classic?
Yeah, written and directed by the great M. Night Shyamalan. And Haley Joel Osment really shines in this, as well as Bruce Willis and Toni Collette in her first delve into horror.
This is probably the best acting that Bruce Willis has ever done.
I think so too. And it's an instant classic. It's another one where when I was watching it, I felt like I was watching an instant classic that I was going to be watching 20 years from then. It's some good, solid, classic scares without being cheap. It's great storytelling, great characters, and the twist is undeniably the work of a master. He might not have been able to duplicate this type of quality and this type of impact after this, but all the stars aligned for this one, and he made a perfect fucking horror movie. It's a great haunted house movie. It's a very emotional movie, and that twist is one of the best in history. And it's a twist that's so good, it gets better upon repeat viewings, because this became so much part of pop culture at the time, you almost got tired of seeing it and hearing about it. And then after all that,
it's been parodied to death, almost like The Matrix.
Yeah. So when you go back and watch it, and I was very familiar with it because I watched it many times back in the day. But when you watch it again and you see the craft that goes into the twist, and you're like, I would have never seen that coming. There's all kinds of hints. He makes it pretty much obvious what the twist is. But to make it that obvious and still unseen by the viewer as you watch it, it's just a masterwork for me. And it's just as dramatic as it is scary. And it's one of those where I hate when ghosts are taunting the protagonist and then he finds out that the ghosts have good intentions and they're just trying to get a message across.
But they're still sinister, though. Yeah. Even though these aren't evil ghosts, it doesn't impact how the horror scenes play out, because every scene where they appear is sinister. And even if they were good ghosts, if you were in that situation, you'd never be able to tell that they were, because they seem pretty horrifying and vicious in their intent.
Yeah, because the only way they know to appear is to be frightening as hell. I mean, what else are you going to do? Especially the one with, what's her name from the OC? That the young girl that was sitting there when he was in his little tent, and he turns around and she's just there with
all the puke coming out of her mouth.
That was probably the biggest scare in the movie.
I need to use this as an opportunity to correct myself. Earlier in the podcast when I was talking about Get Out, I said it was the first movie since The Silence of the Lambs to get a bunch of awards recognition. I just remembered I was wrong. This is actually the first movie since The Sixth Sense.
Oh, yeah.
So my mistake. Apologize, corrected. This movie was nominated for a shit ton of Oscars.
And this is another one that was well deserving of all those nominations. I think he's pretty much chased this type of movie ever since.
And he's never quite reached it or hit it. I think the closest he's ever gone is Signs.
Yeah.
If I had to say if there's one that he came close in doing it, Signs would be the one.
This is a masterwork as far as I'm concerned. The Sixth Sense from 1999 is my number 32.
My number 31 is from 1975, Italian film Deep Red from Dario Argento.
Great one.
This is not my favorite Argento movie, but this is probably the most perfectly made giallo film. For those who don't know, the giallo films were slasher mystery movies that put more emphasis on the aesthetics and the visuals and kind of the fetishization of the murders themselves.
Yeah.
This has some of the prettiest blood I've ever seen in a movie. It's almost candy colored and beautiful, whereas some of the scenes are horrifying and it gets pretty violent, but it's such a delight to look at. For one, you know it's not real. So it's not the same thing as taking pleasure in actual violence.
Yeah.
But there's just something about the way that Dario Argento frames everything, where he makes the most macabre, disturbing imagery seem beautiful. I think it works really well as a mystery movie. A lot of the giallos worked better as slasher movies than they did as mysteries. This one works just as well as mystery. There's a lot of good interplay between the two main characters. There's a lot of good atmosphere in the movie. And there's a lot of things that make this movie great that have nothing to do with the plot of the film itself. A lot of just strange sequences, like for example, there's a little girl in the movie. She doesn't really play a big part in the story at all, and if you took her part out, it wouldn't really alter anything about the storyline, but the movie would be a little bit less creepy with her without her performance there. She's just a girl who you think is just a snotty little brat, and you realize that she likes to torture animals. And when you realize what it is, you think the father is being harsh on her because you see the father actually slap her. I was like, that's a bit extreme now, isn't it, for a little girl? And you realize it's because she fucking pinned an iguana to the ground and let it stay there. And what makes that scene creepier on a second viewing is when she gets slapped. She kind of licks her tongue where she got slapped, and she seems almost like she's taking a little pleasure in it about how awful she's being. There's a lot of like inexplicable moments in this movie that add to the overall atmosphere of it. Dario Argento has great visuals. The camera work and the way that it's constantly moving around and searching pulls you further into the movie because there's these really long camera angles where you know it's following something's going further. You find yourself leaning further in because you're trying to follow the camera with you. It has a very hypnotizing effect. I love all the camera shots where you see the killer's preparation before he goes out and kills. Of course, being a Goblin score, nobody had horror movies that were scored quite like Dario Argento's, because a lot of his scores don't even sound like they're scores for horror movies. The mystery is involving, the atmosphere is great, and for me, it's the pinnacle of Dario Argento's giallo films.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll cut off your genitals and feed them to your kids.
Don't watch the version that's on Shudder. I really hate to discourage that because Shudder is such a great app and it has a lot of great horror movies, but the version of Deep Red that's on Shudder is actually an American version and it's shortened, and it cuts out a lot of what makes the movie so unique and just gets right straight to the plot, because for the American, they figured that American audiences wouldn't have the patience for all the atmosphere and everything else that makes a Dario Argento movie, so it's like 20 or 30 minutes shorter. I wouldn't want to see a shorter cut of this movie because every frame is so perfectly selected. If you can, I would try to seek it out on Blu-ray so you could actually see the full 2-hour version. Don't see this movie chopped up. It deserves so much more than that.
And the characters too, there's less character development when it's chopped up.
Yeah, definitely.
I love the character, especially that journalist. He has the way of bringing out eccentricities in his characters that don't seem that way at first. Little quirks and stuff.
We come to Dario Argento movies for the style, for the look, for the feeling. He's not the most coherent storyteller. This probably has one of his most lucid and coherent scripts that he's ever worked with. So it's a perfect marriage of a well thought out script, perfectly married to Argento's unique visual style that nobody else has.
A very compelling mystery.
And for that reason, Deep Red is number 31 on my list.
My number 31 is another vampire film from 2008, Let the Right One In. It's a Swedish film directed by Tomas Alfredson and written by John, I don't know how to say this guy's name, John Avdi Lindqvist, who also wrote the novel.
It was amongst 5 films that barely missed out of my top 50, was Let the Right One In.
Really?
I tried to get it in there, but it didn't end up working out that way.
The two standouts in this are Kjær Hildebrandt as Oscar and Lena Leandersson as Ellie. It's about a bullied 12-year-old who befriends a vampire who's been 12 for 200 years and gets revenge on his bullies through her. That pool scene alone is enough to get this into my top 50. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen this.
Shut up.
There's this pool scene. Oscar is being held under the water by these bullies in this big athletic pool. You don't see what's going on above the water. You're down under the water with Oscar, and you see limbs start going into the water where she's up tearing the shit out of all his bullies and dismembering them and pulling their limbs off and throwing them in the water. And just your imagination runs wild and you wonder what it must look like above that water. But you're very in this little boy's head experiencing the event through his eyes, and it's just very effective. And if you want to see exactly how effective it is, watch Let Me In, which was a
solid movie.
Yeah, a much higher budget remake.
American remake, of course.
Yeah, and they could not imitate, no matter how much money they threw at this pool scene, they could not imitate what this director done on a fairly low budget. But just that scene is great, and that's just one of many great scenes in this film. And that's why Let the Right One In, vampire movie from 2008, is my number 31.
It's a very special, unique vampire movie.
Yeah.
Kind of like 30 Days of Night, it's set in a snowy setting, but uses it to a much different effect. The feeling it gives off is a little bit more cerebral. And one of the coolest aspects that they never incorporate into vampire movies is the fact that you have to invite them into your home in order for them to come in. That's how they seduce you. In the movie, when she doesn't get let into a house and she just goes in, you see her start to crack and peel, and you see it started to kind of rip her fabric apart until she's actually invited into the house. So kudos for actually putting that in. You don't see that enough in vampire movies.
And that was part of a very dramatic scene between these two characters. Like
yes.
they were at odds with each other, and she was doing this to prove a point.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
My number 30 is Diabolique from 1955, another French horror movie directed by Henry Georges Clouzot. Hitchcock actually made Psycho in response to Diabolique. He wanted to try to top what this director did. And Henry Georges Clouzot is one of those directors that's really, really underrated. He is the French equivalent to Alfred Hitchcock. He's every bit as good as he is, but he didn't make as many movies, and he doesn't have as much of an impact on popular culture, so you don't really see him discussed as often. But this is one of his absolute masterpieces. It revolves around a boarding school for young boys, and the head of the boarding school is this very sadistic man, and he treats his wife like shit. His mistress works for him at the school, his wife works for him at the school. They both know that they're being played by him, so the movie revolves around a plot to take him down, to murder him and get away with it. And they do end up murdering him, and that's not a spoiler because that's a big part of the plot of the movie. But after they murder him, things keep going wrong. His body disappears. It ends up in different places. All these kinds of strange mysteries happen, and you start to wonder, is there something supernatural going, something not? It keeps you on the edge of your seat the entire time, and the ending is such a fucking shocker, and it almost pisses you off that it plays out the way that it does. Mm-hmm. It's very involving, and it has kind of a mean, nasty spirit to it that I don't think is present in Alfred Hitchcock films, and I think it has to do with American sensibilities versus European sensibilities. So they get away with a lot more in European films of the 1950s and 60s than American movies do.
Yeah.
Because this portrays an abusive domestic relationship in a very realistic way without ever showing anything, but it's enough to actually piss you off and enrage you. I can't picture American movies from that era tackling domestic violence and spousal abuse the way that Diabolique does. I feel like I've said enough, because after that you just need to discover how the story plays out on your own and how it ends for it to have its impact, and it's totally worth seeking out if you've never seen it. My number 30, Diabolique from Henry Georges Clouzot. I recommend anybody who has never seen this to seek this movie out immediately.
And for the longest, I'd only seen the remake.
With Sharon Stone, right?
Yeah, which kind of pales in comparison to that one. All right, my number 30. Doesn't make any sense that it's even on here. And this is a movie that I'm convinced that I love this movie more than anybody on this planet. It's The Children from 2008. Completely unassuming film that flew under the radar for the most part. It's from the UK. It's directed and co-written by Tom Shankland, with a story by Paul Andrew Williams. It's about a family Christmas gathering that turns deadly when the kids start turning on the adults and killing them. It's a great ensemble cast. All the children are just as good as the adults. It's realistic characters, and the drama between the family is very realistic and compelling. It weaves the drama perfectly into the horror, and the kids are creepy as hell, and the setups for the kills are amazing. The kills are amazing. It's riveting drama throughout. These kids almost manipulate the adults into believing that they're innocent while they're doing the killing.
Kids have that ability.
Yeah, once they start killing, it's not just blind, mindless killing. They actually try to fool most of the adults into believing that they're innocent. So you got the adults turning on each other that are family. And at the beginning, you get just enough of time with the family to realize exactly what the differences are between them, what are the wedges that are driving them apart, and what keeps them together. And there's a dynamic where it was these two sisters, and one of the sisters has a teenage daughter, and she becomes very much a part of the story. And it's got some scenes of just riveting suspense, like nail-biting suspense in this. And I thought it was way better than it had any right to be. Another great film set in the snow is The Children from 2008 is my number 30.
My number 29 is a movie we already discussed. Jaws from 1975, Steven Spielberg's masterpiece. And let's just put it this way, it is not only the ultimate shark movie, the ultimate monster movie, and just a fucking beast of a film. When I say that, I mean it is so impeccably crafted and so well done. So many of the set pieces, like I said earlier, always keep you on the edge of your seat.
Yeah.
And it's one of those movies that's been so parodied so many times, and the cover of Jaws has been fucking parodied to death. It's almost viewed a little bit more as a pop culture phenomenon, and its status as a film, I feel like, is a little bit forgotten sometimes. If you remove yourself from that and go back and watch, you realize, holy shit, this is an incredibly made movie. And what makes it work even better is that the premise of the movie is actually ridiculous when you stop down and think about it. Sharks don't eat people. There's never been an instance where a shark has eaten a person. There's been shark bites. Sharks bite people, but they don't like the way the people taste and end up usually flying away. So many people have been injured by sharks, but sharks don't actually eat people. So the premise is ridiculous, but it sells it so fucking well. And it does it by keeping the monster hidden most of the time. You don't really see the shark until the end of the movie. And like you pointed out earlier, that isn't even by design.
Yeah.
You would never know it from watching the movie that the shark wasn't meant to be in it, though. All it does is build up perfect suspense that you only see its POV. You only see like its fin coming out of the water heading towards you. It's kept a mystery. It is absolutely flawless. I mean, Steven Spielberg has done more serious films than Jaws, movies like Schindler's List, and has done movies with even bigger budgets like Jurassic Park, or more emotional movies like E.T. As far as like pure craftsmanship, I don't know if any of his movies is as perfectly realized as Jaws is. It is completely and totally without any flaw whatsoever. Still holds up to this day, always has me on the edge of my seat. It's a timeless film, and for me, that's why Jaws is number 29 on my list.
My number 29 is Trick or Treat, another newer film from 2007. Written and directed by Michael Dougherty. I love any movie that's a quintessential example of what it is. And this is a Halloween movie. It's Halloween through and through. It uses Halloween folklore and urban legends to weave these 5 stories. It's set in the same neighborhood on Halloween. One is a school principal who's secretly a serial killer. One of them is about a college virgin who hunts for her first time. The third one is a group of teens pull a mean prank and to get it turned on them. Fourth one is a woman is mean to a Halloween-obsessed husband. And the fifth one is a mean old man who has to contend with a demonic trick-or-treater who turns out to be Sam.
All these mean people.
Yeah, again, it's a perfect Halloween movie that plays on traditions and urban legends. And Sam is an instant horror icon. And all the stories are entertaining on their own. And they're also even more entertaining when they start intertwining. And it kind of goes out of sequence the way Pulp Fiction does in order to tell each story and in order to weave them into each other. And it's just a fascinating movie, and I still have a lot of fun with it, watching it every year.
I have to agree with you about it too. It's a pretty ballsy task to set out and make the ultimate Halloween movie about the holiday and make it a staple to watch every year. And it succeeded on that completely, because you see over the years And it's not that old of a movie, but over the past 10 years or so, I feel like every year I hear more about more and more people watching Trick or Treat on Halloween. And the fact that it's 5 different short stories with a little wraparound allows you to get a variety of horror storytelling.
And it's a great horror film besides being a good Halloween film. I just want to be in that neighborhood. That's the way I've always wanted my neighborhood to look on Halloween.
Everybody participating, everybody's into it. That's so rarely the case.
Jack-o'-lanterns everywhere, brown leaves falling everywhere. Everyone's in costume, adults and kids. Everyone has their yard all tricked out.
Almost like the ultimate Halloween fantasy.
Yeah.
Almost like a movie for Halloween fetishists.
Yeah, and there's some good surprises. There's some of the, especially the one with Anna Paquin, where the story starts out at one thing and becomes something completely different.
The stories are all different and distinctive enough that they stand out. But it's hard to call it an anthology movie just because they end up connecting.
I mean, it works as an anthology just because each one of these stories stand well on its own. But the way they intertwine is the real magic of the film for me. I love Sam. Who would have thought to make Sam an horror icon? A little miniature trick-or-treater.
Have you seen the horror fan art of Michael Myers taking out Sam trick-or-treating on Halloween?
Oh, no.
It's really cool. There's a lot of fan art that has Michael Myers, like that's his son, taking him trick-or-treating around. I really, really love that image.
For me, it ended up being even more of a Halloween staple than Halloween.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll cut your nose off and feed it to my goldfish.
My number 28 is from 1972. Wes Craven's magnificent debut, The Last House on the Left.
Nice.
It's a raw and defiant portrait of murder, rape, and violence. And it's a touchstone in horror because not only just because of what it influenced, though it's certainly a big part of it, it seemed to set off a new wave of grindhouse horror movies that took the more fantastic horror elements of way and just plunged you into the raw reality of all of it. Kind of like Maniac or Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, where all the killers are regular, normal people who are just disgusting human beings. Nobody wears a mask. Nobody has a gimmick or anything like that. They're just awful people. And it revolves around a pair of teenage girls who are trying to hitchhike to a rock concert in New York City. And they're trying to pick up some weed on the way. And they end up getting trapped by this little group of murderers who are very sadistic, who end up eventually taking them out and raping these poor girls and torturing them.
Shut up.
And it has one of the most effective scenes in any horror movie I've ever seen. After one of the girls is raped, she gets up and she walks away while a very cerebral song is playing on the soundtrack. And all the villains just look down at their hands and they see all the grass on their hands. They see the blood, the dirt, the cake, and they look kind of filthy, like because they just did something very vile and inhumane. And they're looking around at each other almost like, what did we just do? What is wrong with us? And the way that she just casually so walks off after she's just been raped, you could see that she's dejected, and you could just see almost like the human spirit being extinguished inside of her. And it's a very harsh scene to actually watch. So I feel like the aftermath of it and the holy shit, look at what we did, is more effective than the actual rape scene itself, which is already really disturbing. Yeah. And then I like that it turns into a revenge film. Like a lot of great revenge films, these people end up getting what's coming to them and you end up rooting for them to get slaughtered. They end up at the house of the parents of one of the victims, and they don't know where she's at. These poor nice people let these killers into their house, and they realize when they look at the pictures that it's their parents, and the parents slowly come to realize who they are because the mom starts checking their clothes and sees articles of clothing, and then they go off and they these people up. The mom bites off one of the guy's dicks, and you end up rooting for the parents to go and kill. But once it's over, you end up feeling kind of sad and depressed because at the beginning of the movie, the parents were like the nicest, sweetest, most innocent people. And by the end, you could tell that they have kind of a look at the same type of look that the murderers do after they rape a young girl. Like, what did we just do? You know that these poor, innocent people are never going to be the same after they did that, because can you only imagine what that type of violence would do to the human soul, what it would do to your spirit, where you start off as a good person and then you have to force yourself to become a killer, to do something that you never thought you'd ever do. So the movie has a profound loss of innocence that makes it more... It's more than just a rape revenge movie. It's about how violence affects every person on an individual level, whether or not it's justified. a great debut for Wes Craven. I have to say, Wes Craven kind of softened after this movie.
Oh, yeah.
Don't you think? Because most of his other great horror movies are a lot more playful.
You have one of the greatest taglines in horror history, too.
It's only a movie.
Yeah, whatever. Just tell yourself, it's only a movie. It's only a movie.
Shut up.
I felt myself having to say that sometimes while I'm watching it because it's so intense.
Yeah, it turns out it wasn't just a gimmick. It actually makes you feel like that.
Yeah.
All right, my number 28 goes back to the zombie subgenre, and one of the best, if not the best, of the subgenre, which is Dawn of the Dead from 1978, written and
You
directed.
scared me.
What?
I thought you were going to say Dawn of the Dead from Zack Snyder.
Oh, no, hell no. This was written and directed by George A. Romero, of course. The huge standout for me in this is Ken Foree as Peter. And on this one, the zombie virus is spreading further from Night of the Living Dead. And we follow a group of characters who seek refuge in a mall. And then to complicate things, besides the zombies trying to get in, a gang of bikers breaks in and tries to make it their hiding place. And it's great social commentary about consumerism, it's as you always see in George Romero films.
Brilliant social commentary in that one.
And music by Goblin was great in it. And it's excellent and memorable practical effects by the great Tom Savini.
Dario Argento actually had a hand in helping with Dawn of the Dead, which probably explains the Goblin connection.
Yeah, but this just through and through an excellent horror film, an excellent zombie film, and one of the examples of how great horror is. When you start talking about the greats in horror, you always have to mention Dawn of the Dead.
See, the thing with Dawn of the Dead is that's a masterpiece and it's a great film. It didn't make my list only because I have two other movies on the list and I almost put it on, but for the sake of giving the list a little bit more variety so they're not just populated, I kind of made a rule where it's like 2 per franchise. If there's a franchise movie, I can only put 2 in it, and I ultimately went with Day of the Dead, though that's just a personal thing. I get why Dawn of the Dead, though, is considered the ultimate zombie movie by so many fans, and it is a fucking great movie. It just works on every level. It holds up for me to this day, and it's kind of funny too. Is that not the perfect metaphor to see a bunch of zombies walking around a mall mindlessly? And I think there's another funny part in the movie that always makes me laugh every time I see it, when one of the characters mentions, why are they here? Why are they drawn to here? It's like they're drawn to things that they did in real life.
Yeah, that's their everyday thing.
That's the perfect image of what a mall is, a bunch of zombies.
It's almost the same premise of ghosts and spirits, how they just mindlessly go through their routine that they did in life. They don't know that there are ghosts walking past you.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll stab your eardrums with an ice pick.
Now, number 27 is a movie from 1979, and this is dipping back around to something we discussed earlier on my list. My number 27 is Nosferatu the Vampire, Werner Herzog's remake of the great Nosferatu film. I know a lot of people will be like, do you put that above the original Nosferatu? And I think they're both masterpieces, and Max Schreck's Count Orlok is a little bit scarier than Klaus Kinski's Count Dracula. In this one, they had the rights to Dracula, so they actually used the names from the novel. This one takes everything that I love about the original Nosferatu and adds so many more layers to it. Where I don't think that Klaus Kinski is as scary as Max Schreck, I find him a little bit more endearing. The performance is very animalistic, where I feel like I see the rodent in him, the way that he scampers about. There's something very rat-like in his performance and the way that he runs around. And I love how Werner Herzog staged the plague of rats in this one. And you could tell that they're actually real rats that they set out and they set loose in this in the city, and it's fucking gross. It has the air of authenticity to it. It feels genuinely like it was made in the 1890s, and they use the same location as the original Nosferatu in the Carpathian Mountains. And that's another thing that makes it special, is its location. Now, in my view, while I love the original Nosferatu and I think it's one of the greats, it's on my top 50, but this one uses that location to even greater effect, I think, than the original did. You get to immerse yourself in the environment and the atmosphere of what it's like to be in Dracula's lair, and I think that's just part of Werner Herzog's style. He's very much into cerebral, earthy images, and he's very much all about his locations. He never shoots on sound studios, and it looks like cameras were taken back to the 1890s and just started filming stuff. Nothing about it feels modern at all. It feels like you're watching a folk tale play out right before your eyes. Another thing that adds greatness to this movie is not just Herzog's beautiful, masterful direction and Klaus Kinski's great performance. It's Isabelle Adjani as Lucy Harker brings so much to this movie. She is so beautiful in a way that seems really otherworldly, almost like a porcelain doll. And there's a way that she carries herself. There's a certain dignity to her movements and everything. And you know, instantly when you see her, you get the feeling that she's going to be the one who is going to take down Dracula, that only she is special enough to go toe-to-toe with something like that. And it actually improves upon the ending of the original Nosferatu, and I'm not going to spoil what the ending is, but the original Nosferatu is a great movie, but it kind of just ends and it's over, and it's just like, oh, okay, whatever. That's the case with a lot of older movies. They don't necessarily always have the best endings. This one has a much better ending than the original one did, and you get to see the pathetic humanity behind Nosferatu a little bit more, because it becomes very clear that he only wants to be loved. That's what it's like to be a vampire, is that you are starved of love. You're just filled with this empty, voidless feeling that you can never chase away, and it's almost like hell. So Max Schreck's interpretation of the character, while scarier, is not as humane, and you don't have sympathy for him. You feel like you're looking at a demon. Klaus Kinski's take on the character is horrifying, yes, scary, yes, but almost achingly pathetic in its humanity and the way that he just wants release from his life of pain. And it recreates some of the scenes so well, and I like that it's paced like a silent movie too. It moves very slow, and it feels like time is slowing down while you're watching this film, and you're experiencing life as it unfolded back then, which would be much slower paced, much more cerebral. Excellent use of locations, some fucking absolutely gorgeous cinematography on Werner Herzog's parts, two great lead performances in Klaus Kinski and Isabelle Adjani, just an absolute masterpiece, and one of the rare remakes that I feel improves upon the original. And what makes it interesting is most remakes that improve upon the original are not improving upon a masterpiece. They're just improving upon a movie. This takes a film that's already a masterpiece, and in my view makes one that's even greater. So for that reason, Nosferatu the Vampire, Werner Herzog's rendition of the classic tale, is number 27 on my list.
Cool. Nosferatu 2.
Nosferatu the Vampire.
My number 27 is a bona fide classic as well. The Thing from 1982, directed by John Carpenter.
Another masterpiece, Michael.
Yep. This is written by Bill Lancaster, who wrote the Bad News Bears. It's weird. And based on John W. Campbell Jr.'s story, Who Goes There? It stars Kurt Russell, Wilford Brimley, and Keith David as the standouts among a great ensemble cast. It's set in Antarctica, and like Dog Soldiers, I like the ensemble cast of male actors, and they aren't from the military, but they are kind of military types, and to see the camaraderie between them and the drama that arises between them, that's multiplied when the Thing shows up. Everything gets worse when trust is taken out of the equation, and there was already some contention between some of these guys, and then when they can't trust each other and you don't know who's the Thing, it gets even worse. The makeup effects by Rob Bottin are legendary.
Arguably the greatest makeup effects in horror movie history, period.
Yeah.
Arguably. They are so unbelievably effective, so disgusting, so wet, and so imaginative too. The shapes that this monster takes, the things that it morphs into, the way that it looks like a hybrid, the way that the body looks when they first discover that human-ish thing, that the face that's like looks like it was dyed screaming, and the gore and the makeup and the slop
and the dog,
oh my God,
the mutated dogs,
the way that they fucking break apart. I think it's hard to overstate just how fucking good the makeup is in this movie. It is insane how much detail and how much they put into it.
Rob Bottin, he doesn't get enough. He gets a lot of credit for this movie, but he just still doesn't get enough because he worked himself to exhaustion.
I think that's so obvious. I mean, if you look at the quality of the makeup, that's something that you would have had to have poured everything into to pull off.
And he did have some assistance, but it was almost all him. Mm-hmm. And I think didn't Rick Baker help with some of this? And he
didn't want to take credit.
Yeah, he was so impressed with Rob Bottin's work and how hard he worked on it that he just didn't want to credit on it. But man, what a movie! And this one used to not even be in my top 50 when I was growing up. I always thought it was cool creature effects, a good monster movie, but I was kind of bored with it up until then. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I was able to truly appreciate it, because this is one that I've watched on and off here my whole life. And I didn't truly appreciate it until the past few years, and I got into filmmaking, and I seen the craft of it and how good the performances are.
It's impeccable craft, isn't it?
Yeah. And it really gets inside the head of these characters, and you really get to know them before they're hit with these horrific mutations.
I don't know anybody who doesn't like The Thing. People don't like it. It's because it tends to be too effective or it freaks them out too much. I've never heard anybody say that this is a bad movie or they think it's not good or it's not well put together.
Listen to this podcast or I'll gut you.
My number 26, and this is the last one I'm going to be revealing until next week's podcast, is from 1994, Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
Yes.
Now, for me, this is the scariest Freddy Krueger movie out of all of them. It's one of the most original and inventive slasher movies in the history of the subgenre, and it actually predates Scream in terms of the meta commentary being shoved into it. Scream's meta commentary is a little bit more removed from it, where you're supposed to appreciate it more as an audience member. This one, the meta is unfolding within the characters' lives, and I love the premise of the movie. The fact that it takes place outside the universe of the rest of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, that it's about the actors who were in these movies and the makeup artists who worked on them, and the idea that Freddy Krueger is a demon that can only be contained by storytelling, and once the story is over, the demon comes out of the box. So when Freddy starts penetrating into the real lives of the people involved in the movies, there's something about it that's kind of weirdly amusing and really strange, but it's the creepiest Freddy has ever been. The makeup is not as iconic as the original look of Freddy Krueger, but it's more realistic burn victim makeup in Wes Craven's New Nightmare. His presence is more demonic. He's more menacing. He's completely stripped of all the silly one-liners that you see in so many of the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, even the ones that I love. And you could tell that Robert Englund was having a great time playing the darkest version of Freddy that's ever been on the screen before.
And playing himself.
And
Robert
playing
Englund.
Himself in the movie, too, which is kind of funny to have Heather Langenkamp playing herself. It plays great tribute to what the Nightmare on Elm Street, what the legacy is, while also recognizing the flaws in the series and what it became after, because obviously Wes Craven was a little bit resentful of what the franchise turned into after his first movie. You could tell this is Wes Craven coming back to his most famous creation and reclaiming it. The presence of Wes Craven in this movie is funny, for one thing. So there's a lot of stuff that's really funny in this movie.
The presence of Bob Shea, too.
The presence of Bob Shea, Jesus Christ, dude, that was hilarious, too. So much about this movie is actually really fun, but the scares when they come are really effective. You could tell that Wes Craven was trying to sell that, no, this is a real demon. This isn't just Freddy Krueger from the movies or anything. This is a legitimate terrifying threat. And Robert Englund just did such a great job of taking Freddy in a more demonic direction. And I love the scene the babysitter gets dragged across the ceiling in the hospital. It's right up there for me with the first time that Tina gets dragged across the ceiling. And it's every bit as visceral and maybe even a little bit more disturbing. Maybe not as cool or as iconic as the original Nightmare on Elm Street, but it's a little bit more disturbing than that is. It's so effective, it's so inventive, and I feel like it doesn't get enough credit for what it is. If this were not the 7th movie in a slasher film franchise, it would be taken much more seriously as a film, or people could see a lot of the genius behind Wes Craven's screenplay, because I feel like he did a little bit of Kevin Williamson before Kevin Williamson did it, but more so, I feel like he did Charlie Kaufman before Charlie Kaufman was a thing. And you know Charlie Kaufman, the writer of Adaptation, Being John Malkovich, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Charlie Kaufman is an undeniable original and one of the great screenwriters, no question about it. But I feel that Wes Craven beat him to the punch as far as those types of movies go. But the fact that it's a 7th film in a slasher franchise means that it was never going to get the same attention or adulation as an original work that's not a genre film.
Yeah.
Its status as the last of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies has really robbed people of the ability just to see how good this movie is. Or it's one of the best achievements of Wes Craven's career, and for me, one of the most effective horror movies to come out of the 1990s, and it holds up on repeat viewings. I've seen it many times. It's always effective, it's always scary, it's always entertaining, it always leaves me with a smile on my face when it's over.
Yeah, that movie completely reinvigorated the franchise, and it was another great performance by little Miko Hughes from Gage Creed.
Oh, some of those scenes with him as a little kid, where he has the knives on his fingers and he starts acting like Freddy and his mouth starts foaming and he starts screaming uncontrollably. That's some pretty fucking intense acting. And from what I understand, the way they got him to act so intensely is his parent. They told Wes Craven to tell him that his parents died, or that his mom was killed or something like that. It was like a little trick and it would make him act wild.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's kind of cruel. Yeah. But it works.
Yeah.
It works.
And some of those scenes under the sheet with his little dinosaur.
Oh, those are really cool.
They're really effective. It makes you feel like you were when you were a little kid, when you're dreaming about something that's horrible coming towards you and you just put your blankets over your face hoping that'll hide it.
Yeah.
All right, my final movie for this podcast before we do our final 25 on next week's podcast. My number 26 is Hereditary from 2018.
Oh, great choice.
I absolutely love this movie from the first time I watched it. My expectations were in the clouds on this one.
And it delivered.
And it not only exceeded my expectations, it threw me off. It caught me off guard. I didn't expect it to be like this. There was a lot of things that I expected from it that I got, but there was other things that I did not expect at all. And it's written and directed by the great Ari Aster, who's now the great Ari Aster. And a tragedy strikes a family that's already seems kind of broken, and then things get worse from there as they're completely enveloped by evil. And this is a stellar, just tour de force performance from Toni Collette. One of the greatest single performances ever in horror history, as far as I'm concerned.
And she should have gotten more awards recognition. Yes. And I think the fact that she didn't is just because she was in a horror movie.
Yeah,
which is cheated. Too bad, because as far as I'm concerned, that was the acting performance of 2018.
Yeah, between the way she shows a mother's grief after losing a child to the performance as she gets enveloped by evil is just fascinating to watch. And her performance is buoyed by excellent supporting performances by Alex Wolff, especially Millie Shapiro as the daughter and Gabriel Byrne as the dad. Gabriel Byrne had a completely understated performance because I think he was supposed to.
And he's a great actor, though. I think he did a fantastic job of what he's doing.
I think he was doing exactly what he was supposed to do.
And I feel like he's the audience's entry point into the movie because he's observing it the way that we're observing it. He has no control over the chaos that's unfolding, the way his wife is coming apart, the way that things are going wrong with his children. And so he was more or less meant to be an anchor for the movie. He's not as involved in the insanity. It's Toni Collette and Alex Wolff who have to do the bulk of the insane part, the heavy lifting, because they're the ones that are being tormented or haunted. Gabriel Byrne is experiencing the movie that we do, the way that we do, watching a nightmare unfold that we have no control over and wish that we could just get a fucking grasp on it.
And you see these two main characters played by Toni Collette and Alex Wolff. You see these human beings completely break before your eyes. And Alex Wolff has been accused of overacting in this. I don't think so at all.
That's fucking bullshit.
I felt every ounce of his pain and his despair.
He got PTSD. He had to do therapy after doing the role, and I could totally see it because it's an intensive role.
Yeah.
This is some intensive acting that Alex Wolff and Toni Collette are being called upon to deliver, because their performances go to such emotionally raw, naked places that are really uncomfortable. The scene where Toni Collette is arguing with Alex Wolff in the dining room is so realistic, and it feels almost a little bit too real, where I know what it's like to have awkward family conversations like that, for that to be kind of the tension, the resentment between each other. Fucking just absolutely phenomenal acting. Across the board, one of the best acted horror movies of all time.
I love my horror films to have a layer of emotion, and you can't get more emotional than this. It's
Raw emotion. It's not sentimental.
It's one of the most heart-wrenching horror films, if not the most, I've ever seen. It's strange, dramatic, stellar acting. It's completely original. It's a unique atmosphere and a unique sense of dread. Like we've talked about other movies in here that had a unique atmosphere, but this doesn't feel like anything else. It felt completely alien to me.
It radiates an unnameable eerie quality. You know that something's wrong from the very first frame of the movie, though you can never put your fingers on exactly what it is.
And that tragedy that sets everything into motion
powerful.
Is just as effective as it has to be. It absolutely has to be that effective and that shocking. And it was. And to show that head just sitting there in the road after they had left it there for a while and bugs had started to get to it,
And some of the acting is not only emotional, it's emotionally damaging. Where like this looks like very hard places you'd have to go to as an actor. Like you'd have to be traversing the worst pain in your life to pull off these types of performances.
Yeah, and it's an instant classic. It's another one that I knew I was watching a classic when I watched it.
This is going to go up there in the future with The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby and The Shining as one of the great horror movies of all time.
And I think it's one of the most divisive horror films ever made.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, horror fans seem to be completely divided down the middle.
They either love it or despise it.
I think more people actually despise it than love it like we do. But it's divisive for all the right reasons.
Not audience friendly.
Yeah, because of how hard to watch it is. It's deliberately hard to watch. You feel this tragedy. You're not just witnessing a tragedy, you're feeling it happen to these people.
Yes.
And you're feeling their descent into madness, and you feel the mom break the moment her daughter dies. And then the guilt from the daughter dying slowly breaks the son. And it's just fascinating to watch. And the main thing I love about Hereditary is it introduced us to a truly unique voice in the genre.
Ari Aster. Yeah. Oh my, I'm so excited for his film career. And I mean, Midsommar was pretty awesome too. I didn't like it as much as Hereditary. I know some people like Midsommar more, but it's a step in the right direction. It shows that he's going to have a very long career with a lot of inventive, creative ways to explore the horror genre. And they're both very uncomfortable movies too.
Yeah,
they both go to very uncomfortable places, and he seems to revel in that.
Yeah,
to drop you into situations that are very human, but the worst parts of having to be alive, the most uncomfortable situations, the worst type of relationships, and then just when you're sucked in and when you feel overwhelmed by the sheer emotionally damaging aspects of his movies, it hits you with a whole other layer of horror that's more theatrical, and that makes it all that much more effective when it actually does kick in. He's definitely gonna be a new master of the horror genre. Him and Robert Eggers are, to me, right now, the future of horror. And Jordan Peele.
Yeah, and I don't get the complaint of the ending on here. A lot of people liked it but hated the ending. I thought everything that you watched before that was leading up to that. Just like The Witch, where it had kind of almost a fantastical ending when everything else
Or even Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah, when everything else was seeped in reality and it became fantastical toward the end. I thought everything was leading up to that, and I thought it was very effective.
Great choice.
So that's why my number 26 is Hereditary.
So, folks, it has been a very long podcast as Michael have kicked off our top 50. Join us next week as we count down our top 25 horror movies of all time.
Yeah, we've had a very good time with this. We hope you guys are having a good time too. And thank you so much for listening to our 50th podcast. I'm way too excited that it's our 50th podcast, but I'm going to hold on to this excitement because I don't get excited about much these days.
Yes. Well, until next week, folks,
happy horror.